Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So, if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from, and what time you watched this video. I never thought anything like this would happen to me. It's hard to even talk about it, but I've got to get it off my chest. I guess it all started a couple of months ago when my roommate, Sam, started acting weird. We used to be pretty close, not like best friends or anything, but we'd hang out sometimes, get food together, and study in the common room. Then, out of nowhere, she just stopped talking to me. At first, I thought she was just stressed. Finals were coming up, and I knew she had a lot on her plate, but it got worse. She stopped leaving the room. Her side of the room got messier and messier. Clothes and books were piled everywhere. It was like she didn't care about anything anymore. She wouldn't even respond when I knocked on her door. She just stayed locked in there all day and night. It wasn't just a mess or the silence that got to me. It was the noises. At night, I'd hear this strange shuffling coming from her room, like she was moving things around or pacing. Sometimes, I'd hear whispering. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but it didn't sound like she was on the phone. It was too quiet for that, and it wasn't just once or twice. It was every night. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, but the noises from Sam's room were louder than usual. It wasn't just the shuffling anymore. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and went to her door. "Sam?" I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "Sam, are you okay?" Still nothing. I don't know what made me do it, but I tried the handle. It was locked, of course, but something felt off. I leaned in closer, pressing my ear to the door. That's when I heard it. A voice. But it wasn't Sam's. It was deeper, a man's voice. I froze. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else in there. I was sure of it. I didn't hear anyone come in, and I had been in the room all evening. My heart was racing. I thought about calling out again, but something told me not to. I backed away from the door, trying to stay quiet. I didn't want whoever was in there to know I was listening. I went back to my bed and grabbed my phone. I wanted to text Sam, ask her what was going on, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. I sat there, staring at the screen, waiting for a response that never came. The sounds continued for what felt like hours. The tracking, the whispers, and that man's voice. It was like they were having a conversation, but I couldn't make out any of the words. My mind was racing, thinking of all the worst-case scenarios. Who's in there with her? Why hadn't she said anything to me? Should I call the police? Eventually, the noises stopped. It was like someone flipped a switch. The silence was even worse than the sounds. I just sat there, staring at her door, too afraid to move. I don't know why I fell asleep, but when I woke up, the first thing I did was check to see if Sam was still in her room. The door was unlocked. I don't know why, but that scared me even more. I got up and slowly walked over to her door. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand was shaking as I turned the knob. The door creaked open, and I peeked inside. The room was empty. Completely empty. Her bed was neatly made, all her clothes were gone, and the floor was spotless. It didn't make any sense. The room had been a mess just the day before. There were piles of clothes and books everywhere. Now it looked like no one had ever lived there. My stomach turned. Something was seriously wrong. I rushed out of the room and went straight to the dorm's RA. I told her everything, that Sam had been acting strange, that I heard someone in her room, and now she was gone. The RA looked concerned and said she'd check with the housing office, see if Sam had moved out or something. Later that day, the RA came to find me. She said Sam had officially moved out that morning. The thing is, I never saw her leave. I didn't hear her packing up or anything, and I was there all night. I asked the RA if anyone had seen Sam, or the guy who was in her room. She looked at me like I was crazy and said, "What guy?" Sam lived alone. I couldn't believe it. I told her again about the voices, the man I heard in the room. She just shrugged and said no one had been signed in to visit Sam, and there were no cameras in the halls, so there was no way to know for sure. But she assured me that Sam had left, and I didn't have to worry. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I knew I heard. There was someone else in that room with her. And the way she left, it didn't make sense. I tried calling her a few times, but the calls always went straight to voicemail. Her social media accounts were deactivated too. A couple of weeks passed, and I tried to put it behind me. I moved a new roommate in, and things started to feel normal again. But then one night, I heard it again. The shuffling, the whispering, that same man's voice. But this time, It wasn't coming from Sam's old room. It was coming from the room next to mine. I don't know what's going on, but something's wrong with this building. Something or someone is still here. And I don't know how much longer I can stay without losing my mind. I rented the beach house for a weekend. I just needed a break from everything. Work had been stressful, life had been stressful, and I figured a quiet weekend by the ocean would be the perfect way to clear my head. The place was small but cozy, right on the edge of the beach, with a deck overlooking the water. It was the kind of place you'd imagine spending a peaceful weekend, sipping coffee in the morning and listening to the waves. When I got there, everything seemed normal at first. The house was clean, and the keys were exactly where the rental agency said they would be, in a small lockbox by the door. I let myself in, unpacked my things, and settled in. It felt nice to be somewhere quiet. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it walking along the beach, reading a book on the deck, and just trying to unwind. It was the second day when things started to feel off. I woke up that morning to the sound of the ocean. I made some coffee and sat out on the deck for a while, enjoying the calm. After breakfast, I decided to take a walk down the beach again. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The front door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before I left, but I figured maybe I had just forgotten. I locked it again and didn't think much of it. That night, I cooked dinner and watched a movie on the small TV in the living room. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Like the house felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it. After the movie, I went to bed. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The blanket on the bed was folded differently. I didn't fold it like that when I left in the morning. It wasn't a big change, just a small, neat fold at the foot of the bed, but it was enough to make me pause. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself that maybe I had folded it and just didn't remember. But I knew that wasn't true. I always left the blanket crumpled at the bottom of the bed. Always. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I didn't want to overreact, so I tried to brush it off. Maybe the cleaning crew had come in and tidied up without telling me. I hadn't seen anything about daily housekeeping in the rental description, but it was possible, right? I didn't know. The next day, things got weirder. I went out again in the morning, just for a short walk this time. When I came back, the kitchen felt different, like someone had been in there. The dish I had left drying by the sink had been moved, and my coffee mug was in a different spot on the counter. I hadn't touched them. I was sure of it. That was when I started to get scared. I checked all the windows and doors to make sure they were locked, and they were. Everything was locked. There was no sign of anyone else being in the house, but I knew things were being moved. I could feel it. Later that afternoon, I decided to call the rental agency. Maybe someone had a key and had been coming in without me knowing. They told me no one had entered the house since I checked in. There was no housekeeping service, and no one else was supposed to have access to the property. I hung up the phone, feeling uneasy. That night I stayed in. I locked all the doors and windows again, double-checking them this time. I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with another movie, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound in the house seemed louder, more pronounced. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, everything made me jump. I decided to go to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sounds that didn't belong. I must have fallen asleep at some point because when I woke up, it was still dark outside. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 3 a.m. That's when I saw it. On the bedside table, there was a small piece of paper. I hadn't noticed it before. My heart started pounding as I reached for it. The handwriting was neat, almost too neat, and the message was short. I'm watching. My blood ran cold. I sat up in bed, scanning the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the table, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. I dialed 911, but before I could hit call, I heard something from outside the bedroom door. A soft creak. Someone was in the house. I froze. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, clutching my phone, listening to the silence. I couldn't hear anything anymore, but I knew someone had been there. I wasn't imagining it. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally got up the courage to move. I crept out of bed and slowly made my way to the door. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sign of movement on the other side. Nothing. I opened the door just a crack and peeked out into the hallway. It was empty. Slowly, I made my way through the house, checking each room, turning on every light as I went. There was no one there, but the front door was unlocked again. I locked it behind me, checking it twice, and sat down on the couch. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care that I had paid for the weekend. I wasn't staying another night. I left the house as quickly as I could and drove straight home. I didn't even tell the rental agency what happened. I just wanted to forget about the whole thing. But I can't. Ever since that weekend, I felt like I'm being watched. Even now, sitting here in my own apartment, I can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me. I keep my doors locked, I check the windows, but it doesn't help. I don't know who was in that house. I don't know how they got in, or how long they were there. But I know one thing for sure. They were watching me, and I think they still are. I've always loved jogging, especially in the evenings when the sun is low and the park isn't too crowded. It's my way of clearing my head after a long day. There's this park near my apartment, not far, maybe a 5-minute walk. I jogged there almost every day after work. I'd see the same people most of the time, other joggers, people walking their dogs, the usual. It felt safe, familiar. I'd never had any reason to feel uneasy. Until a few weeks ago. The first time I noticed him, I didn't think much of it. It was a weekday, sometime around dusk. The park was pretty empty, with just a few people scattered here and there. I had my usual route, starting at the main entrance, cutting across the bridge, circling around the lake, and then looping back. I noticed a man walking along the path as I ran by. He was dressed kind of oddly for someone walking in the park, wearing a hoodie with the hood up even though it wasn't cold, dark jeans. He wasn't doing anything, just walking. But something about him caught my attention. I passed him once, didn't think much of it. But then, a little while later, I saw him again, standing near the entrance where I'd started. It seemed like he'd looped around the park in the opposite direction, somehow crossing paths with me twice. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just taking a stroll like everyone else. The next time I saw him was a few days later. Same spot, near the entrance. He wasn't walking this time. He was standing there, just looking around. I ran past him, and he didn't move, but I could feel his eyes following me as I went by. I felt a little uneasy, but I didn't want to overreact. It's a public park, after all. People are allowed to be there. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. A week went by, and I tried to forget about it. I kept jogging, sticking to my usual routine. But then I saw him again. It was getting dark, and I was nearing the end of my run. The park was almost empty, and I was heading back towards the entrance. That's when I saw him, standing on the path ahead of me, just off to the side. He wasn't moving, just watching me approach. I slowed down, my heart starting to race. As I got closer, I made contact for a split second before looking away. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there. I picked up my pace, not wanting to pass him too slowly. As I ran by, I felt his eyes on me the whole time. Micah told me something was off. But again, I told myself not to overthink it. The next evening, I decided to change my route a little. I figured maybe if I went at a different time or took a different path, I wouldn't see him. So, I went a bit earlier than usual, around late afternoon, and ran in the opposite direction, starting at the lake this time. It was going fine for a while. I felt more relaxed, like maybe I was just being paranoid the other times. But then, as I was nearing the end of my loop, I saw him again. This time, he was further down the path, but he was walking in the same direction as me. I was gaining on him. I slowed down, not wanting to pass him, but as soon as I did, he stopped walking and stood to the side, just like before, watching me. I felt my stomach drop. He changed his direction again. I didn't know if he was following me or just had some weird pattern, but it didn't feel right. That's when I decided I wasn't going to jog at night anymore. It wasn't worth the uneasy feeling. I figured I'd just stick to early morning runs, or maybe take a break from the park for a while. But a few days later, I found myself back in the park. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was telling myself I was being ridiculous, that nothing was wrong. I decided to stick to a well-lit path and not go too far from the entrance. It was around sunset, and the park was still busy enough that I didn't feel too uneasy. I didn't see him at first, and I started to think maybe he wasn't even there that night. Maybe I'd made the whole thing up in my head. I was about halfway through my run, heading down the main path, when I caught sight of him again. This time, he was ahead of me, on a small trail that branched off into a more secluded area of the park. I slowed down. Something about the way he was standing there, just off the main path, made my skin crawl. He was waiting. I was sure of it. I kept my pace steady, pretending like I hadn't noticed him. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was avoiding him, but I wasn't about to take that trail. As I got closer, he moved. He stepped onto the main path and started walking towards me. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I glanced around, hoping to see someone else nearby, but the park was mostly empty now. I thought about turning back, but it felt too obvious. I kept going, trying to stay calm. As we got closer, he suddenly cut across the path, moving towards me in a way that wasn't casual. It was deliberate. He was trying to intercept me. I stopped, my mind racing. I could turn around and run, but I wasn't sure if I could outrun him. He was closer to the exit than I was. He knew the park better than I did. I could tell that now. I started walking again, faster this time, but he matched my pace. I could see him out of the corner of my eye, trying to close the distance between us. I knew I couldn't make it back to the entrance before he caught up to me. There was a small clearing off the path that led to another trail, one that looped around towards the road. I didn't know the trail that well, but I figured it was my best shot. I veered off the path, heading towards it. As soon as I did, I heard him speed up behind me. He was following me. There was no doubt in my mind now. I broke into a sprint. My legs were burning, my breath coming in sharp gasps, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I could hear his footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. He was gaining on me. The trail twisted through the trees, the branches scraping my arms as I pushed through. My mind was racing, trying to think of what to do. I didn't have my phone with me. No one knew I was out here. Just when I thought I couldn't run any farther, I saw the road up ahead, just beyond the trees. I could hear the distant sound of cars. If I could just make it there, I'd be safe. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I was so close. I could see the break in the trees where the trail opened up to the road. And then I heard him stop. The footsteps behind me stopped. I didn't slow down. I kept running until I burst through the trees and onto the side of the road. A car drove by and I waved my arms, trying to get their attention, but they didn't stop. I turned around, expecting to see him there, but the trail was empty. He was gone. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. I waited, watching the trail, but he never came out. Eventually, I made my way home. I didn't go back to the park after that. I couldn't. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know he was following me. And I know that if I hadn't run when I did, I might not have made it out of there. I got off work later than usual that night. It must have been around 11:30 when I finally pulled into my neighborhood. The streets were empty, just the usual quiet that comes with living in a small town. I was tired and all I could think about was getting home, having a quick bite, and crashing into bed. But when I turned the corner onto my street, I saw it right away. There was a truck parked in my driveway. An old, beat-up truck that I didn't recognize. It wasn't from around here, that much was obvious. My neighbors all had newer cars, and I knew most of them pretty well. This thing looked like it hadn't been washed in years, the paint chipped and rusted in places. It didn't make any sense. I slowed down and pulled up behind it, just sitting there for a minute with my headlight shining on the back of the truck. I was trying to make sense of why it would be there. Maybe someone got the wrong house? But it was late, and I hadn't heard from anyone saying they were coming by. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, leaving the headlights on to light up the driveway. My house was dark, no lights on inside, which made sense because I lived alone. But the truck being there, it set off alarm bells. I felt uneasy, like something wasn't right. I walked up to the driver's side of the truck and looked in through the window. The interior was just as trashed as the outside. Empty bottles on the floor, fast food wrappers crumpled up on the seat. There were no keys in the ignition, and it didn't look like anyone was inside. That's when I heard a movement coming from the woods behind my house. My property backs up to a small patch of forest, nothing too big, but enough trees to make it dark and thick once you get a few feet in. I turned towards the sound, my heart starting to race, and that's when I saw them. 3 figures stepped out of the tree line, moving slowly, like they didn't care that I saw them. They were spread out, each coming from a different part of the woods, but all heading in my direction. The truck must have been theirs. I felt a chill run down my spine as they got closer. They weren't saying anything, just walking towards me, like they had all the time in the world. I couldn't make out their faces clearly because they were still in the shadow, but I could see enough to know they weren't just lost hikers or neighbors coming over to say hi. Something about the way they moved, slow but deliberate, made it clear this wasn't an accident. I backed up towards my car, my eyes darting between the 3 of them. My brain was trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out what to do. I wasn't sure if I should get back in my car and drive off or stand my ground, but my body was telling me to move, to get away. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "What are you doing here?" "This is my property." None of them answered. They just kept walking, slow and steady. One of them was wearing a hooded jacket, his hands stuffed into his pockets. Another had on a cap, his face hidden in the dark. The third one was bigger, taller than the others, with a stockier build. I couldn't make out any details, just the outlines of their figures as they came closer. I was about 10 feet from my car when one of them finally spoke. "We're just here for the truck," the man with the hood said. His voice was low, calm, like this was all normal. Like they had every right to be standing there in my driveway, blocking me in. "Well, you need to move it," I said, my voice shaking a little despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "I don't know what you're doing, but you can't stay here." The man in the hood smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was more like he was amused by what I said, like he was humoring me. "We'll move it. Just give us a minute." They were closer now, too close for comfort. I could see their faces better, and there was something off about the way they were looking at me, like they were sizing me up, deciding what to do next. The air felt thick, like everything had slowed down around me. Without thinking, I reached for my phone in my pocket, my fingers fumbling to unlock it. I didn't even know who I was going to call, 911, a neighbor, anyone. But before I could hit the screen, the big guy stepped forward, quicker than the others, and I froze. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat. "You should put that away," he said, his voice deep and flat. "We're not looking for trouble." I didn't move for a second, my thumb hovering over the phone. Everything in me wanted to run, to get in my car and lock the doors, but I couldn't. I didn't know what these guys were capable of, and I was outnumbered. I had to play it smart, or at least try to. Slowly, I lowered the phone, slipping it back into my pocket. The big guy nodded like I'd made the right choice, but I didn't feel any safer. "We're just gonna grab the truck and go," the guy with the hood said again, his voice calm, like he was in control of the whole situation. The problem was, they weren't moving towards the truck. They were still standing there, too close to me, watching, waiting for something. It felt like they were trying to see how far they could push me, how scared they could make me before I snapped. I took a step back, my back hitting the side of my car, and I glanced at the door handle. If I could get inside fast enough, I might be able to lock myself in and call for help. But I knew they'd see me move, and I didn't know how they'd react. The hooded man must have seen the look in my eyes, because he stepped closer, just a couple feet away now. "Don't do anything stupid," he said quietly, and that smile was back. The same one that didn't reach his eyes. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. The tall guy suddenly turned towards the truck, breaking the tension. He walked over to the driver's side door and opened it. He didn't look at me as he climbed in, but I noticed the other two were still standing there, watching me. I didn't move until I heard the engine start. The truck rumbled to life, and the headlights caught on, bathing the driveway in bright light. The tall guy revved the engine a couple times, but the other two didn't move. They were still watching me. Finally, after what felt like forever, the man with the hood nodded. "We're leaving now," he said, almost like it was a favor. "But you should be more careful." I didn't respond. I couldn't even breathe, right until they finally started moving towards the truck. The big guy in the driver's seat pulled the truck out of the driveway, and the other two climbed into the back. They didn't say anything else, just sat there, staring at me as the truck backed out and rolled slowly down the street. I stood there, frozen in place, until they disappeared around the corner. Even then, I couldn't move for a minute, my mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. Once I was sure they were gone, I scrambled into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone. I called the cops right away, my voice barely steady enough to explain what had just happened. They didn't find anything. The truck was gone by the time they got there, and there were no signs of anyone in the woods. No footprints, no nothing. It was like they'd never been there at all. I don't know who those guys were or what they wanted, but I haven't felt safe at home since. Every time I pull into my driveway now, I can't help but look around, half expecting to see the truck parked there again, those men stepping out of the woods. I've thought about moving, but I haven't yet. I just keep hoping it was a one-time thing, that they won't come back, but I don't know for sure. I had been feeling off for a while, like the stress of everything was building up too much. Work was getting harder to deal with, and I just needed to get away, clear my head. So I rented this cabin, way out in the woods, for a long weekend. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, single-story cabin. A little rundown, but it looked cozy in the pictures. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just trees and quiet. That was the whole point. When I got there, it was already late in the afternoon. The drive took longer than I thought, winding roads that turned into dirt paths the deeper I went into the forest. The cabin looked the way I expected from the outside, weathered wood, a sagging porch, but it had a certain charm. There were a few other cabins scattered through the trees, but they were pretty far off, and I didn't see anyone around. Perfect, I thought. Just me, the quiet, and my thoughts. The inside of the cabin was simple. A small living room with an old couch and a wood stove, a tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, and a bedroom with a queen-sized bed. It wasn't exactly luxury, but it was clean enough, and I unpacked my things, setting my bag down by the bed. I didn't need much for the weekend, just a couple of books, some food I'd brought along, and my journal. I made a fire in the stove, opened a beer, and settled in for the night. The first evening was fine. Peaceful, actually. I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, listening to the wind rustling through the trees and the distant sound of the creek running behind the cabin. It felt good to be alone, to not have to think about work or people or anything. Just me and the quiet. When it got dark, I went inside, locked the door, and headed to bed. That's when I first noticed something that seemed a little off. There was this smell, faint but noticeable, like something damp and musty. I thought maybe it was the old wood or the cabin just being closed up for a while. I didn't think much of it, though. I opened a window to let some air in, and figured it would go away. I woke up in the middle of the night. I'm not sure what woke me, but something felt wrong. I could hear this faint creaking sound, like the floorboards were shifting under someone's weight. I laid there for a minute, trying to tell myself it was just the old cabin settling, that old buildings made noises like that. But it kept going slow and steady, like someone was walking around. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The wind had picked up outside, the trees making soft, shuffling sounds, but underneath it, I could hear it again. The creaking wasn't coming from inside the cabin, it was coming from the porch. My heart started racing. I grabbed my phone, but of course no service. I checked the time, it was just after 2 a.m. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon. I wasn't used to the sounds of the forest, so it was easy to let my mind jump to conclusions. But then I heard the sound again, louder this time, like someone putting their weight on the porch steps. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, moving towards the front door. The fire in the wood stove had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want to make any noise. I stood there for a second, listening, and that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, right outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen for what felt like forever, waiting for something else to happen. Part of me expected the door to burst open, someone to come crashing in, but nothing happened. The footsteps just stopped. I crept over to the window beside the door, careful not to make any noise, and peeked through the crack in the curtains. It was too dark to see anything clearly, just the outline of the trees and the faint light from the moon. No one was there, at least not that I could see. But I knew what I'd heard. Someone had been out there, I was sure of it. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I laid there, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound, any sign that whoever or whatever it was had come back. The rest of the night passed in silence. The next morning, I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably just my nerves, being out there alone for the first time. I made coffee, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest, but when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the porch, there were muddy footprints. Not animal prints, human. They weren't large, probably about my size, but they were unmistakably shoe prints, and they were fresh, still damp from the morning dew. Whoever had been out there last night had walked right up to the door. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I looked around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but everything was still. The footprints led from the steps and disappeared into the dirt path that led back into the woods. I couldn't tell where they went from there. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but I didn't want to give in to my fear. This was supposed to be my weekend to clear my head, to get away from everything. I convinced myself that maybe it was a hiker or someone who got lost in the woods and found the cabin by accident. They probably didn't mean any harm, but still the thought nagged at me. Why would someone come up to the door in the middle of the night and not knock? Why didn't they say anything? I spent the day trying to shake it off, but I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. But there was no one, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. That night, I locked the door and put a chair up against it. I wasn't going to take any chances. I made sure all the windows were locked, too, and I kept the fire going in the stove, hoping it would help me sleep. But I couldn't relax. Every creak, every gust of wind had me on edge. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a sound. A soft thud, like something bumping against the door. I sat up, my heart racing, listening. It happened again, another thud, this time louder. It sounded like someone was trying to push the door open, testing it. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left by the bed and crept towards the door, my hands shaking. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, as I approached the door. The chair I'd wedged under the doorknob was still in place, but the door itself was rattling, like someone was trying to force it open. I stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any weapons, nothing to defend myself with. I thought about yelling, trying to scare them off, but my throat felt tight, like I couldn't get the words out. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Whoever it was had gone quiet. I didn't move for what felt like hours, just standing there in the dark, clutching the flashlight. Eventually, I crept back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I just laid there, wide awake, waiting for something else to happen. The next morning, I found more footprints. This time, they circled the cabin, like whoever it was had been walking around, looking for a way in. I didn't waste any time. I packed my things, threw them in the car, and got the hell out of there. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I'm not going back. That cabin might have seemed like the perfect escape, but now I can't shake the feeling that someone had been living there, waiting for someone like me to show up. And I was lucky to get out when I did. It was supposed to be just a quick trip to the mall. My daughter, Emma, needed some new shoes for school, and I figured we could grab lunch afterward. She was excited about getting a new pair of sneakers, the ones with the lights that blink when she walks. She wouldn't stop talking about them the whole way there, and I was glad for the chance to spend some time with her. Work had been crazy lately, and I felt like I'd been missing out on these small moments. We got to the mall around noon, and it was busy but not too crowded. Families, teenagers, the usual Saturday crowd. Emma's small hand was wrapped around mine as we walked for the entrance. She was bouncing along, full of energy. I led her toward the shoe store, and she immediately ran over to the kids' section, her eyes scanning the shelves for the shoes she'd been talking about. I smiled, watching her, trying to soak in the moment. I let go of her hand for just a second to grab my phone from my pocket. I had a text from work, something about a deadline, but it wasn't anything urgent. I sent a quick reply and shoved the phone back in my pocket. When I looked up, Emma wasn't in front of me anymore. It didn't hit me right away. I thought she had just moved to another aisle, still looking at shoes. But when I walked over to where I thought she'd be, she wasn't there. I called her name. Emma? No answer. I walked around the section, scanning the aisles, thinking maybe she'd wandered over to the clothes or the toys. Nothing. My heart started to race. I told myself not to panic. She was probably just nearby, maybe got distracted by something in the mall. I walked faster, calling her name a little louder now. Emma? Emma, where are you? I circled the store, my eyes darting between people, looking for her little blonde ponytail and pink jacket. But she wasn't there. I stepped out into the main corridor of the mall, my head whipping around, scanning the sea of faces. Emma? I shouted this time, but no one even looked my way. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and my stomach twisted in knots. Where was she? I rushed to the nearest security desk, my voice shaking as I told the guard I couldn't find my daughter. He nodded, his face calm, like this was something he dealt with all the time. He picked up a walkie-talkie and started talking into it, describing Emma. We'll find her, he said, his voice steady, but it didn't do much to calm me down. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. I couldn't just stand there waiting. I started walking again, faster this time, almost running through the mall, shouting her name. I tried to think where would she have gone. She knew better than to wander off. I had drilled it into her head 100 times. Stay close. Don't talk to strangers. But she was only 6, and kids don't always listen. I was just about to call the police when my phone buzzed. I yanked it out of my pocket, expecting a work message, but it wasn't. It was a number I didn't recognize. Hello, I said, my voice shaking. A man's voice answered. Is this Emma's dad? I froze. Yes, I am. Do you have her? Is she okay? She's fine, the man said, his tone calm, too calm. I found her wandering near the food court. She looked lost, so I figured I'd call the number on her ID bracelet. Relief flooded through me for a second. Emma always wore a bracelet with my number on it in case we got separated. Thank God, I breathed out. Where are you? I'll come get her right now. I'm just outside, he said. Out by the west entrance. The one near the parking garage. That didn't sound right. The west entrance was on the opposite side of the mall from where we'd been. But maybe she had wandered farther than I thought. It wasn't impossible. I started walking, still holding the phone to my ear. Okay, I'm on my way. She's safe, the man said again, and something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. But you'll want to hurry. I started moving faster, weaving through the crowd. My mind was racing, but something wasn't sitting right with me. His voice, there was something off about it. Too calm, too controlled. And why hadn't he just taken her to security? Why the west entrance? Can I talk to her? I asked, slowing my pace a bit. There was a pause. Just a second, but it was long enough to make my heart lurch. She's with me, he said, dodging the question. Like I said, just hurry. I stopped walking. My hand tightened around the phone. I want to talk to my daughter, I said, my voice sharper this time. Put her on the phone. Another pause. Then the man's voice came back, a little colder now. Just come to the west entrance. That's when it hit me. Something was very, very wrong. My stomach dropped, and my legs felt weak. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct in my body was screaming that this wasn't right. I'm calling the police, I said, my voice shaking. If you have my daughter, you'll stay where you are until they get there. The line went dead. I stood there, frozen in place, my hand still gripping the phone, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. That voice. I knew in my gut he didn't have her. At least, not in the way he wanted me to think. I ran back to the security desk, out of breath, trying to explain what had just happened. The guard's face changed when I told him about the call. He picked up the phone immediately, calling for backup, his voice urgent now. Minutes passed like hours. I felt sick, dizzy, imagining all the terrible things that could be happening. The police arrived, and I gave them the number that had called me, described the man's voice, everything I could remember. They told me they'd trace it, but I could see it in their faces. They knew it wouldn't lead anywhere good. Then, just as I thought I was going to collapse from fear, one of the guards came rushing toward me. We found her, he said, and for a moment, I couldn't even process the words. She's at the shoe store, he said. One of the employees found her hiding in the back, near the stockroom. I ran, not caring how fast I was moving, or who I bumped into. I sprinted through the mall until I got to the store, my heart pounding in my ears. And there she was, sitting on a bench, holding a stuffed animal the store clerk had given her, tears streaming down her face. I grabbed her, pulling her into my arms, holding her so tight I could barely breathe. Daddy, she sobbed, burying her face in my chest. I was looking for you, and I got scared. I'm here, I whispered, holding her close, my hands shaking. I'm here, baby. The police never found the man. The number he called from was a burner phone, untraceable. They checked the security footage, but the west entrance cameras were down that day. It was like he planned it, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget that voice on the phone, the way he sounded so calm, so sure. And I'll never stop wondering what would have happened if I'd gone to the west entrance that day, if I hadn't listened to my gut. All I know is that I almost lost my little girl, and I'll never be able to shake the feeling that she was just a few steps away from something terrible. I hadn't seen Mrs. Brenner in days, which was odd. She was the kind of neighbor you couldn't miss, always outside tending to her flowers, waving to people as they walked by. I'd moved into the house next to hers about 5 years ago, and since then, I'd gotten used to seeing her almost every day. Even when the weather was bad, she'd be out there, in her thick jacket and gloves, pulling weeds or chatting with whoever passed by. At first, I thought maybe she had gone to visit her sister. She'd mentioned her sister a few times, said she lived in another state and didn't see each other much, so sometimes she'd take a trip to stay for a week or so. That made sense, but something about it still nagged at me. Mrs. Brenner was in her late 70s, and she always told me when she was going away, asking me to keep an eye on her house while she was gone. But this time, there was no knock on my door, no casual conversation over the fence. By the 4th day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her car was still parked in the driveway, which made the whole visiting her sister thing impossible. I tried telling myself I was just overthinking it. Maybe she was sick and didn't want to worry anyone. Maybe she'd lost track of time. I even considered calling her, but I realized I didn't have her phone number. Despite our frequent conversations, we'd never exchanged that. So that afternoon, I decided to walk over to her house and check in. I figured at worst, I'd knock and she'd answer, and I'd feel ridiculous for worrying so much. Her house looked normal enough, but it felt different. It was too quiet. No wind chimes clinking in the breeze. No sound of the TV faintly playing through the windows. I walked up to the front door and knocked, my knuckles rapping against H. There was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, listening carefully for any sounds inside, footsteps, the creak of a floorboard, anything. But the owl stayed silent. I stepped back, glancing around the neighborhood, wondering if anyone else had noticed her absence. There were no other neighbors around, and I hadn't seen anyone mention it in passing. I took a deep breath and tried the door handle, telling myself I'd just jiggle it, see if it was locked, then leave. But when I turned the knob, the door swung open. I stood there for a second, frozen. It wasn't like Mrs. Brenner to leave her door unlocked. She was careful, always mentioning how she kept the windows latched and the doors double-locked. The uneasy feeling I'd had all week came rushing back, stronger now. "Mrs. Brenner?" I called out, my voice shaky as I stepped inside. The owl smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in days. I hesitated in the entryway, looking around. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. Her shoes were neatly lined up by the door. Her purse was hanging on the hook by the closet. But something still felt wrong. I walked further into the house, into the living room. The curtains were drawn, casting long shadows across the room, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. Mrs. Brenner's favorite armchair sat empty, a throw blanket neatly folded over the back. The TV remote was on the side table, exactly where she always left it. "Mrs. Brenner?" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. I started to feel stupid. Maybe she was just upstairs, sleeping or resting. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away, so I made my way toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom step. That's when I saw a dark smudge on the wall near the base of the stairs. It looked like a handprint, a smeared, dirty handprint. My stomach dropped. I walked closer, reaching out to touch it, but stopped myself. I leaned in, squinting at the mark, and I knew it wasn't dirt. It was blood. My heart started pounding in my chest, and suddenly the silence in the house felt suffocating. I backed away from the stairs, my mind racing. Maybe she'd fallen, hurt herself, and couldn't get to the phone. Maybe she was upstairs, injured, needing help. I bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, calling her name over and over. "Mrs. Brenner. Mrs. Brenner." I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty house. I reached the top and turned down the hallway toward her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. The bed was made, the pillows fluffed, everything perfectly in place. But there, just inside the door, was another smudge, more blood, this time on the edge of the doorframe. I felt sick. Something had happened to her. I was sure of it now. I turned, checking the bathroom, the guest room, but they were all empty, just as neat and tidy as her bedroom. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange. The closet door at the end of the hall, it was cracked open just an inch or two, like someone had hurriedly shut it, but hadn't pulled it closed all the way. I swallowed hard, taking a step toward it. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and my hands felt clammy as I reached for the knob. I told myself it was probably nothing, just my imagination running wild. But as I gripped the doorknob, a cold dread settled over me. I yanked the door open, and inside, huddled on the floor in a corner, was Mrs. Brenner. She was alive, barely. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her hands were shaking, and her clothes were stained with blood. She looked up at me, her lips quivering, but no words came out. "Oh my God," I whispered, dropping to my knees beside her. "Mrs. Brenner, what happened? Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring at me, her eyes darting to the door behind me, like she was afraid someone would come in at any moment. I reached for my phone, fumbling to dial 911, but before I could press the call button, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "He's still here." My blood ran cold. I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Who's still here?" She shook her head, her grip tightening on my wrist. "He said he'd come back. He said if I tried to leave, he'd come back in." Her voice broke, and she started to sob, her whole body shaking. I didn't know what to do. I needed to get her out of there, but the thought of someone else being in the house made my skin crawl. I stood up, my legs trembling, and glanced toward the stairs. "Mrs. Brenner, we need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though I was anything but. "I'll get you out of here. We'll go to my house, and I'll call the police from there." She didn't move, didn't respond, just sat there, her eyes wide and fixed on the hallway like she was expecting someone to walk through the door any second. I crouched down again, trying to coax her up. "Come on, we have to go," I said, practically begging her to move. That's when I heard it. The front door creaked open downstairs. My heart stopped. I froze, my eyes meeting Mrs. Brenner's. She let out a small whimper, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the house. I couldn't breathe. I glanced around the room, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. There was no time. I grabbed Mrs. Brenner's arm, pulling her up as gently as I could, guiding her out of the closet. She was trembling, barely able to stand. The footsteps grew louder, closer. We moved down the hallway as quietly as we could, my heart pounding in my chest so hard I thought it might give us away. I led her into the guest room, where there was a small window that faced my house. It was our only way out. I helped her climb up onto the windowsill, praying the person downstairs wouldn't hear us. She winced as she hoisted herself through the window, and I followed right behind her, sliding out just as the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. We dropped down onto the grass, and I half carried, half dragged her across the yard, my eyes darting toward the house the whole time. I expected to see someone come charging out after us at any second, but no one did. Once we were in my house, I locked every door and called the police. They came, swarming Mrs. Brenner's house, but whoever had been there was long gone. They found blood, just like I had, but no sign of the man Mrs. Brenner had described. She never spoke about it again. Not to me, not to the police. They searched for him, but he was never caught. And Mrs. Brenner? She sold her house and moved away within the month. When I got home that evening, I was tired. It was one of those days where work just dragged on, and all I wanted to do was make dinner and relax. I parked in my usual spot, grabbed my bag, and headed for the front door. Nothing felt off at first. The street was quiet, and the sun was just starting to set. Everything looked normal. I unlocked the door and walked in, kicking off my shoes like I always do. I tossed my keys on the little table by the door and started heading to the kitchen. The house was quiet, too quiet, maybe, but I didn't notice it right away. I had this habit of zoning out after work, just thinking about nothing, so I wasn't paying much attention. Then I heard it, a soft clinking sound. At first, I thought it was something outside. Maybe the wind had knocked something over, or maybe a neighbor's dog was messing around. But then I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from the kitchen. I stopped walking, my heart picking up a little. It was strange. I hadn't left anything out that could make noise. I took a few more steps, slow, careful, and that's when I saw it. There was someone sitting at my kitchen table. I froze, standing in the doorway, staring. It took a second for my brain to catch up, to make sense of what I was seeing. A man, someone I'd never seen before, was just sitting there in my kitchen like he belonged there. He had a cup of coffee in front of him, my cup, and he was casually stirring it with a spoon. He looked up when he saw me, his face calm, almost relaxed. He smiled, a small, polite smile, like this wasn't completely insane. "Hey there," he said, his voice low and friendly. "You're home early." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just stood there, my mind racing. Who is this guy? How did he get into my house? My first thought was maybe I'd left the door unlocked, but that didn't make sense. I always lock up when I leave. I finally managed to say something, though my voice came out shaky. "Who are you?" The man didn't seem bothered by the question. He just kept stirring his coffee, like this was the most normal thing in the world. "I could ask you the same thing," he said, "but I won't. I already know." That threw me off. My stomach tightened, and I felt a cold sweat starting on the back of my neck. Something was wrong, really wrong. This wasn't some confused neighbor who'd wandered into the house. This guy knew what he was doing. I took a step back, my hand instinctively going to my phone in my pocket. "You need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know how you got in here, but you need to go. Now." He didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly, studying me like he was trying to decide something. "Why would I leave?" he asked, sounding genuinely curious. "I have every right to be here." That sentence hit me like a punch to the gut. Every right to be here? What the hell was he talking about? "This is my house," I said, my voice rising. "You don't belong here." The man sighed, finally putting the spoon down. He leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms, still perfectly calm. "You're mistaken," he said. "You think this is your house, but it isn't." "Not really." I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline kicking in. I needed to get him out, but I didn't want to push him too hard. There was something off about the way he spoke, something that made me feel like he wasn't all there. I had no idea what he was capable of. Look, I said, trying to reason with him. I don't know what you think, but this is my house. I've lived here for 3 years. I don't know who you are or why you're here, but you need to go before this gets worse. The man's smile faded slightly, and for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression, something darker. 3 years, huh? He said, almost to himself. That's cute. I took another step back, my hand gripping my phone tighter. I'm calling the police. His eyes flicked down to my hand, and he smiled again, but this time it wasn't friendly. Go ahead, he said. Call them. But by the time they get here, you'll wish you hadn't. That was it. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait any longer. I pulled my phone out and started dialing, my hands shaking, but before I could hit the call button, he stood up. It was fast, too fast. 1 second, he was sitting calmly at the table, and the next, he was on his feet, moving toward me. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet as I backed into the hallway. Wait, he said, holding his hands up like he was trying to calm me down. But there was something in his eyes now, something that wasn't right. We don't need to do this. We don't need to make this ugly. I didn't say anything. I just kept backing up, my finger hovering over the call button. I've been here a long time, he said, taking another step forward. Longer than you know. This house, it's not yours. It's never been yours. You're just a guest. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, and I pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, and then he lunged. He was fast, but I moved faster. I bolted down the hallway, slamming the door to the living room behind me as hard as I could. I heard him crash into it a second later, the sound of his fists pounding against the wood. Open the door, he shouted, his calm voice now replaced with something cold and sharp. You can't stay in there forever. I ran to the front door, throwing it open and stumbling outside. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted down the driveway, not even daring to look back. I made it to the street just as the operator answered, and I screamed into the phone, telling them someone was in my house. The police arrived in minutes, though it felt like hours. I stood outside, trembling, watching as they stormed the house, guns drawn. I expected to hear shouts, maybe even gunfire, but instead, they came out a few minutes later, looking confused. There's no one in there, one of the officers said, his brow furrowed. We checked every room. The place is empty. I stared at him, my mind spinning. That's impossible. He was right there in the kitchen. The officer shook his head. We didn't find anyone. Are you sure you saw? I'm sure. I snapped, my voice shaking. He was there. He said it wasn't my house. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, and I could see the doubt in their eyes. I wanted to scream at them, to make them understand, but I didn't have the energy. I was too shaken, too scared. They took my statement and said they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They thought I'd imagined it, that maybe I'd just been stressed or tired. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. That night, I couldn't stay in the house. I packed a bag and went to a friend's place, telling myself I'd deal with it in the morning. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, somewhere, waiting. I never went back to that house. I was driving through the desert on my way to visit a friend. It was a long, empty stretch of road, the kind where you don't see another car for miles, and the sun was starting to set. It was beautiful, in a way, but also kind of eerie. There wasn't much out there besides sand and rocks, and the occasional tumbleweed blowing across the road. I was about halfway to my destination when I saw him. A man standing on the side of the road, his arm out, thumb up. A hitchhiker. I don't know what made me slow down, but I did. I was always careful about who I picked up, especially in a place like this, but something about him made me hesitate. He didn't look threatening, just tired, maybe a little desperate. His clothes were dusty, like he'd been up there for a while, and he was squinting into the sun as I pulled up next to him. Hey, he said, leaning down to the window. Car broke down a few miles back. You mind giving me a lift? I should have said no. Looking back, I know that, but at the time, I just felt bad for him. The desert wasn't a place you wanted to be stranded in, especially with the sun going down. So against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. Sure, I said. Hop in. He smiled, just a small, tired smile, and got into the passenger seat. He didn't have any bags or anything, just the clothes on his back and a jacket tied around his waist. As soon as he shut the door, I felt a little knot of anxiety in my chest, but I ignored it. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Just nerves from being out here alone. Thanks, he said, settling into the seat. I've been walking for hours. And where do you need to go? Just a little further up the road, he said, glancing out the window. There's a gas station not too far from here. That seemed reasonable enough, so I started driving again, keeping my eyes on the road. The silence in the car was heavy, though, and I could feel him looking at me every once in a while. I tried to make small talk, asking about his car and how long he'd been stranded, but his answers were short, almost clipped. He didn't seem interested in chatting, which made me feel more uncomfortable. But again, I pushed the feeling aside. After about 20 minutes, we were still driving, and I hadn't seen any sign of a gas station. The road just stretched on, endless, with nothing but desert all around us. "How far did you say the gas station was?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Not much further," he said, but there was something in his voice that made my skin crawl. It was too calm, too controlled. I glanced over at him, and that's when I noticed something strange. He wasn't looking out the window anymore. He was staring straight ahead, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "No problem," I replied, forcing a smile. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Okay," I said slowly, turning my eyes back to the road. A few more minutes passed in silence, and then he spoke again, his voice low and even. "Actually, do you mind pulling over here for a minute?" I blinked. We were in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing around us for miles, just sand and scrub. "Why?" I asked, my hands tightening on the wheel. "I need to stretch my legs," he said. "Won't take long." Something about the weight, he said, had made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to stop, not here, not now, but I didn't want to argue with him either. I could feel the tension in the car, thick and heavy, and my gut was screaming at me to keep driving. "I don't think it's a good idea to stop out here," I said, my voice coming out shakier than I intended. "We should just keep going until we find that gas station." He didn't respond right away, but I could see him shifting in his seat, like he was trying to decide something. Then, without warning, he reached over and grabbed the wheel. My heart nearly stopped. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt as I fought to keep control. His grip was strong, too strong, and he yanked the wheel hard to the right, pulling us off the road and onto the sand. "What the hell are you doing?" I screamed, trying to shove his hand away, but he was too fast. Before I knew it, he had the car in park and was reaching for the keys and ignition. I reacted on instinct, slapping his hand away and grabbing the keys before he could. I scrambled to open the door, my hands shaking, and practically fell out of the car, hitting the ground hard. My knees scraped against the rocks, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I could hear him getting out on the other side, his boots crunching in the dirt. He wasn't in a hurry, though. He was taking his time, like he knew I had nowhere to go. The sun was almost gone now, the desert quickly falling into shadow. "Where do you think you're going?" He called out, his voice still calm, almost amused. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the keys in my hand like a lifeline. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I looked around, desperate for something, anything I could use to defend myself, but there was nothing. Just endless desert in every direction. I turned and started running, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder than I ever had in my life. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps steady, unhurried. He wasn't chasing me. He didn't have to. He knew I couldn't outrun him out here. "Come on," he called, his voice carrying through the still air. "You're not going to make it far. Just give up." I kept running, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. My chest ached, my legs were on fire, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him, still following me. A dark silhouette against the fading light. He wasn't rushing. He didn't need to. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually my legs gave out. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, the keys still clutched in my hand. I could hear him approaching, his footsteps slow and deliberate. This was it, I thought. This was how it was going to end. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, with no one around to help me. But then I remembered the car, the keys in my hand. I forced myself up, my entire body screaming in protest, and started running back toward the car. I could see it in the distance, just a small shape in the growing darkness. I didn't look back, didn't listen for his footsteps. I just ran. Somehow I made it. I practically threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me and jamming the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I didn't waste a second. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning in the sand before catching and launching the car forward. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, watching me drive away. He didn't try to chase me. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. He knew I wouldn't forget this. He knew I'd be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a town, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I never saw him again, but I can still hear his voice sometimes in the quiet moments when I'm alone. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. It started about 2 weeks ago. At first, I didn't think much of it. I get a lot of junk texts, spam calls, all that, just like anyone else. The first message came late at night. I was already in bed, half asleep, when my phone buzzed. I glanced at it, expecting some random notification or spam, but it was just a photo. No words. The picture was of me. I was walking down the street, just leaving the coffee shop I go to most mornings. My head was down, and I had a cup in my hand. I remember that day. It was sunny, and I was running late for work. It didn't look like a selfie or anything like that, though it was clearly taken from a distance. It made me feel weird, but I figured maybe someone sent it by mistake. People take random photos all the time. I deleted it and went back to sleep. The next morning, there was another one. This one was from that same day, but I was standing at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. It was a different angle, but it was definitely me. I stared at it for a minute, feeling uneasy, but again, I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. It had to be, right? But it didn't stop. The texts kept coming, always photos of me, always in places I recognized. Sometimes it would be from earlier in the day, sometimes from days before. They weren't just of me walking around, though. One was of me sitting at my desk at work. Another one was of me waiting in line at the grocery store. Someone was following me. The thought hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. I felt sick. How long had this been going on? How many pictures were there? I started going through my texts again, scrolling back to that first photo. My heart raced as I counted the messages. There were more than I realized. Most of them were taken in places I go regularly, my apartment building, the park near my office, the same coffee shop. But some were from places I didn't even notice anyone near me, places where I was sure I was alone. That's when I realized it wasn't random. Whoever was sending these photos knew where I would be. They knew my routine. They were watching me. I didn't know what to do. Should I go to the police? What could they even do with some pictures? They weren't threatening me, not directly. And I didn't have any idea who was behind it. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid that it was just some creep with a camera. But the pit in my stomach grew deeper with every new photo. I was always looking over my shoulder, checking my phone constantly, waiting for the next text. Then it got worse. About a week ago, I got a picture that stopped me cold. It was me again, but this time I was standing in the doorway of my apartment. My hand was on the doorknob, and I was looking over my shoulder like I had heard something. I didn't remember that moment at all, but the timestamp on the text was from earlier that same day. That picture was taken from inside my apartment. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. I had locked the door. I was sure of it. I always locked the door. How did they get inside? Was it taken while I was home? Were they still there when I got back? The thought made my skin crawl. I rushed to check the locks on the windows, the door, but everything was secure. There was no sign of a break-in, nothing out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I got more photos. This time, they were closer. A picture of me brushing my teeth in the bathroom mirror. Another of me sitting on the couch watching TV. I hadn't even heard my phone buzz when they came in. Whoever was doing this was either incredibly quiet or they were using some kind of remote camera. Either way, it didn't matter. I felt trapped, violated, like I couldn't even be safe in my own home. I tried to think of who it could be. A neighbor? Someone from work. I even considered the possibility that it was someone I knew, maybe a friend messing with me, but none of it made sense. Nobody I knew would do something like this, and certainly not to this extent. I decided to change my routine. I started taking different routes to work, going to different coffee shops, avoiding the usual places I went. I even changed the locks on my apartment, just in case. But it didn't matter. The photos kept coming no matter what I did. Whoever it was, they knew everything. Every step I took, every place I went, they were always one step ahead of me. One night, I got a message that wasn't a photo. It was a short text. Nice new lock. I froze. I hadn't told anyone about changing the lock, not even my landlord. How did they know? I felt panic rising in my chest, my hands shaking as I held the phone. I wanted to reply, to ask who they were, what they wanted, but I was too scared. Instead, I threw my phone on the couch and started pacing, my mind racing. That night, I heard noises. It was past midnight, and I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Then I heard a faint creak, like someone was moving around in the hallway. I shot up, my heart pounding. I held my breath, listening, but everything was quiet again. Maybe it was just the building settling, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I grabbed my phone and checked the front door through the peephole. Nothing. I opened the door just a crack and peered into the hallway. It was empty, but when I stepped back inside, I saw it. Another photo. This time, it was lying on the floor, right in front of the door. It wasn't a text this time. It was a printed picture. My blood ran cold as I picked it up. It was a picture of me, standing in the hallway, just like I had been a few seconds ago, looking through the peephole. I was done. I grabbed my phone, my wallet, and my keys, and I left. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get out of there. I got into my car and drove, not even thinking about where I was going, just putting as much distance between me and my apartment as I could. I stayed at a hotel that night, keeping the lights on and the door locked with a deadbolt. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I went to the police. I showed them the photos, explained everything that had been happening. They took it seriously, at least more seriously than I expected, but they couldn't do much. The officers said they'd look into it, but without a suspect or any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do right away. I haven't been back to my apartment since. I don't know if I can. It was just after midnight when I heard the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. I never have visitors that late, and I was already in bed, watching TV with the volume low. At first, I thought I imagined it. Then it came again, louder this time, like whoever was outside wanted me to hear it. I hesitated, lying there for a minute, my heart already picking up speed. I live alone. It's a small house, kind of tucked away at the end of a long street, no close neighbors. It's usually quiet, sometimes too quiet, but that night it felt different. Something about the knock unsettled me, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone's car broke down, or they got lost. I got out of bed and crept to the front door, careful not to make too much noise. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow from the kitchen light I'd left on. I stood there for a second, listening, hoping they'd just go away. But then I heard a voice, muffled through the door. A man. Hello. My car broke down, can you help me? His voice was calm, almost too calm. I felt my stomach drop. Something didn't feel right. I stayed quiet, hoping he'd think no one was home and leave, but he knocked again, more insistent this time. Please, I just need to use your phone. My cell's dead. I don't know why, but something about the way he said it made me feel uneasy. I've seen enough stories about people using excuses like that to get into someone's house. I wasn't about to let a stranger in, not this late at night. I stayed behind the door and called out, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm sorry, I can't help you. You should try down the road. There's a gas station not far from here. There was silence for a moment, and I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe he'd just leave. But then he knocked again, harder this time, and when he spoke, there was something different in his voice. Less polite, more forceful. Come on, I just need to use your phone for 1 minute. It's cold out here. My hands were shaking now. I backed away from the door and went into the kitchen, grabbing my cell phone off the counter. I dialed 911, keeping an eye on the front door. I hadn't heard him leave, and I didn't want to take any chances. The operator answered, and I tried to keep my voice down as I told her there was a man at my door, that he was being persistent, and I didn't feel safe. She asked me for my address and said officers were on the way, but it might take a little while since I lived outside the main part of town. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, but I didn't say anything else, just listening. I could still hear him outside, pacing back and forth on my front porch, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He knocked again, and this time it felt more like a demand than a request. Open the door, just let me in for a second. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. There was no way I was letting him in, but I didn't want to make him angry either. I couldn't see him through the peephole, it was too dark, but I could hear the impatience in his voice. I told you there's a gas station down the road, I said, trying to sound calm. You can get help there. I heard him mutter something under his breath, and then there was silence again. I thought maybe he had given up, but then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the doorknob rattling like he was trying to turn it. My heart raced, and I backed up even further, gripping my phone so tight my knuckles hurt. I was trapped. I couldn't leave through the back door because it was stuck, old house, old problems, and I wasn't about to confront him. Then he spoke again, his voice lower now, almost a whisper, but I could still hear the anger underneath. Why are you being like this? I just want to come inside. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. The 911 operator was still on the line, but I didn't want to speak and make any noise. I just stood there, frozen, listening to the doorknob rattle. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, I heard him stop. There was a long pause, and I could hear him breathing heavily through the door, like he was trying to figure out what to do next. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't dare move. And then just as suddenly as it started, the rattling stopped. I heard his footsteps again, this time moving away from the door. I waited, my whole body tense, wondering if he was really leaving or if he was just trying to trick me. I stayed where I was, listening intently, but I didn't hear anything else. No more knocking, no more footsteps. I didn't dare go to the window to check, afraid he might see me. I just stayed there, gripping my phone, waiting for the sound of sirens, waiting for someone to show up. It took almost 15 minutes, but finally, I saw the flashing lights outside. I rushed to the door and opened it just enough to see the officers standing on the porch. They asked me what happened, and I told them about the man, about how he'd been trying to get inside. They looked around the property, but didn't find anyone. One of the officers stayed with me while the other drove around the neighborhood to see if they could find him, but they came back empty-handed. No sign of the man, no car broken down on the road. It was like he had just vanished. The officer asked if I wanted them to stay for a while, but I said no. I didn't want to feel like a prisoner in my own house. But after they left, I locked every window and door, checked them twice, and stayed up the rest of the night with the lights on. I never saw the man again, but for weeks afterward, I was terrified every time I heard a knock on the door. Even now, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I'd opened it. I always liked the solitude of camping. Not the kind where you're surrounded by other campers, but real camping. Deep in the woods, away from everything. It's the only time I feel like I can really clear my head. No distractions. Just the quiet of the trees and the crackle of a fire. This time, I picked a spot about 6 hours from home, way off the main roads. No self-service. No people. I figured I'd stay for a couple of days, maybe do some hiking, and just enjoy the peace. I set up my tent next to a small stream and got everything organized. By the time I had the fire going and my gear sorted, the sun was already setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The first night was fine. Typical stuff, crickets, wind rustling through the leaves. I slept pretty well. The second day, I hiked for a few hours and didn't see a single person. I remember thinking how perfect it was, how lucky I was to find a spot this secluded. I got back to camp late in the afternoon, cooked up some food over the fire, and settled in for another night under the stars. It wasn't until well after dark that things started to feel off. I was sitting by the fire, staring at the flames, when I thought I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling in the distance. At first, I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or something moving through the underbrush. But then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded more like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I stood up and listened, holding my breath. The fire crackled, but beyond that, everything was quiet. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the wind or a raccoon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees around the campsite. Nothing. Just shadows and the occasional flicker of light reflecting off the leaves. I sat back down, but I couldn't relax. Every few minutes, I'd hear another noise, a twig snapping, leaves crunching. Always far enough away that I couldn't tell for sure what it was, but close enough to keep me on edge. It was around midnight when I heard the voices. At first, I thought I was imagining it. They were faint, almost like they were tarried on the wind. I stood up again, my heart pounding. This time I was sure. There were people out there talking quietly. I called out, "Hello? Anyone out there?" No answer. Just a soft murmur of voices, like a group of people whispering to each other. I shined the flashlight into the trees again, sweeping it back and forth, but I couldn't see anyone. The firelight didn't reach far beyond the campsite, and the woods were dark, almost too dark. I called out again, louder this time. "Hello? Who's there?" The voices stopped. That's when I saw them. Just beyond the edge of the light, barely visible between the trees. 3, maybe 4 figures standing still, just watching. I could barely make out their shapes, but they were there, staring at me. My heart was racing now. I tried to sound calm, but my voice shook. "What do you want?" They didn't answer. They didn't move. I stepped closer to the fire, keeping the light on them, but they stayed just out of range, like they were waiting for something. I felt trapped, surrounded by the dark, with these people standing there, watching me in silence. "Look," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "If you're lost, I can help you find your way back, but you need to say something." Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just them, standing there in the shadows. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for them to do something. It felt like forever. Then one of them finally moved. A slow step forward, just enough to come into the light. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, his face mostly hidden by a hood. But I could see enough. His eyes were locked on me, cold, expressionless. He didn't say a word. I took a step back, feeling the heat from the fire against my legs. I wanted to run, but my tent, my car, everything was right there, behind me. I couldn't just leave it all behind. I thought about grabbing the hatchet I'd brought, but it was in the tent, and I didn't want to turn my back on them. "Listen," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know what you want, but I think you should go." The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me, and then I saw the others start to move. Slowly, they stepped closer, just a few feet at a time, like they were trying to close the distance without scaring me off. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. This wasn't right. They weren't lost. They weren't here by accident. They were circling me, moving in like predators. I grabbed a burning log from the fire and held it out in front of me, the flames casting long shadows across the trees. "Stay back," I warned. "I swear to God, I'll use this." They stopped, just for a moment, as if they were deciding what to do next. Then the man in the hood took another step forward, his hand reaching into his jacket. I didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. I threw the log hard, and it hit the ground in front of him, sending sparks flying. For a second, they all froze, and I took my chance. I grabbed my flashlight and ran for the tent, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't bother packing up my gear. I just grabbed the car keys and bolted for the trail. Behind me, I could hear them shouting now, their footsteps pounding against the ground as they chased after me. I didn't dare look back. I sprinted through the trees, barely able to see in the dark, the flashlight bouncing in my hand as I ran. I could hear them getting closer, their voices growing louder, more aggressive. I stumbled over a root, nearly falling, but I caught myself and kept running, my lungs burning with every breath. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, and I wasn't sure if I was even going the right way anymore. But I couldn't stop. I knew if I did, they'd catch me. After what felt like forever, I finally saw the outline of my car through the trees. I ran for it, fumbling with the keys, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I jumped inside, slamming the door behind me, and hit the lock button just as I saw the first of them break through the trees, running toward me. I jammed the key into the ignition and started the engine, my hands still shaking. The headlights lit up the trail, and I saw them, 3 men all standing there, just a few feet from the car, their faces hidden by the shadows. I didn't wait. I floored it, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the trail, away from the campsite, away from them. My heart was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through me as I drove as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away. Only then did I pull over, my hands gripping the steering, while so tight my knuckles were white. I sat there for a long time, just trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. I never went back for my gear. I had booked a room in a high-end hotel for a weekend. It was one of those trips I'd been looking forward to for a while, a break from everything. The kind of place where they greet you at the door, take your bags up for you, and offer you a glass of champagne when you check in. I'd saved up for it, and I was ready to just relax. The room was on the 18th floor, with a balcony overlooking the city. After checking in, I ordered room service, took a shower, and got comfortable. It was around 10 p.m., and I was scrolling through my phone, half watching some random show on TV, when the hotel phone rang. I didn't think much of it, figured it might be the front desk or housekeeping checking in. I answered, and a man on the other end told me in a calm voice that there had been an emergency and I needed to evacuate the room immediately. I asked what kind of emergency, and he said something about a gas leak on my floor. The thing that threw me off was how casual he sounded. There was no panic in his voice, no urgency, just a flat, calm tone like he was reading off a script. Still, it was enough to get me out of bed. I wasn't going to risk ignoring it. He told me to grab my essentials and step into the hallway, where someone would meet me to direct me to safety. I asked if I needed to use the stairs, and he just said yes. The weird thing was, the fire alarm wasn't going off, but I figured maybe they were trying to keep things calm. I grabbed my purse and shoes, leaving the rest of my stuff behind. The man on the phone had said to leave everything that wasn't necessary. When I got to the door, I hesitated. I don't know why, but something in the back of my mind told me to stop. I put my hand on the door handle and paused. I could still hear the TV playing, the room perfectly normal, no sound of alarms, no other guests rushing out of their rooms. Everything was quiet. I was just about to open the door when I heard something on the other side. It wasn't loud, just a light shuffle, like someone moving their feet. I froze. I leaned in closer to the door, listening. Whoever it was on the other side wasn't saying anything. I could feel my heartbeat picking up, that sense of dread creeping in, telling me something wasn't right. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see maybe a staff member or another guest. But there was no one there. Just an empty hallway, dimly lit by the overhead lights. I stared at the door for what felt like forever, my hand still on the handle. Then, before I could stop myself, I unlocked the door. The moment I did, it was like something snapped. The door flew open, and this man, this complete stranger, pushed his way inside. He didn't give me a chance to react, didn't say a word. He just shoved me hard, sending me stumbling back into the room. He closed the door behind him and locked it. My first instinct was to scream, but he was on me before I could even catch my breath. He grabbed my arm, yanking me toward him, his grip like a vice. I could smell the sweat on him, see the wild look in his eyes as he stared at me. His face was pale, with this eerie calm that made my skin crawl. I tried to pull away, but he didn't let go. "Stay quiet," he said, his voice low and flat, like the man on the phone. I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I kept glancing toward the door, trying to figure out a way to escape, but he was blocking my way. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, and he looked strong. There was no way I could overpower him. "What do you want?" I finally managed to choke out. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a phone. I thought he might have been checking for something, but then he turned the screen toward me. It was my name, my reservation information. Everything about me, my name, my address, the details of my stay, was there, as if he had access to the hotel system. My blood ran cold. How the hell did he get that? "I know who you are," he said, his voice calm, almost emotionless. "And I know you're alone." That's when the real fear set in. He wasn't just some random intruder. He planned this. He knew exactly who I was, where I was staying, and for how long. I didn't know what to do. I felt like every second that passed was another second closer to something horrible happening. He didn't say much after that, just kept me there, standing in the middle of the room while he watched me. I thought about running, but I knew I wouldn't make it. My mind raced, trying to figure out a way to get out of this. I could see my phone sitting on the nightstand, but it might as well have been a mile away. He'd seen me reach for it. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. My only hope was getting him out of the way long enough to unlock the door and run. But he was standing too close, watching every move I made. Then, in a brief moment of clarity, I realized something. The hotel had those panic buttons on the nightstand, next to the phone. I had seen it earlier when I checked in. If I could get to that, maybe I could set off some kind of alarm, alert the staff. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Look, I don't know what you want," I said, keeping my voice calm, trying to stall him. "But you don't have to do this." He didn't respond, just kept staring at me, his eyes cold and distant. I took a step toward the bed, acting like I was backing away out of fear. I needed him to think I was scared, that I was going to do whatever he said. Slowly, I edged closer to the nightstand, my heart racing in my chest. He watched me, but he didn't move, didn't seem to notice how close I was getting to the panic button. When I was finally close enough, I made my move. I lunged for the nightstand, my hand slamming down on the button. I expected a loud alarm, something to happen immediately, but there was nothing. No sound, no flashing lights. For a second, I thought I'd messed up, that the button didn't work. But then I saw the flicker of realization cross his face. He knew what I'd done. He rushed toward me, grabbing me by the arm again, but this time I fought back. I swung at him, hitting him as hard as I could. I don't know if it hurt him, but it was enough to make him let go for a split second. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock as I heard him coming up behind me. I managed to unlock it just as he grabbed the back of my shirt, yanking me away from the door. But I was already halfway out. I screamed louder than I'd ever screamed in my life, hoping anyone would hear me. The hallway was empty, but I didn't stop. I ran, barefoot and panicked, down the hall toward the elevators. Behind me, I heard the door to my room slam shut, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs burning as I sprinted toward the safety of the lobby. When I finally reached the elevators, I hit the button frantically, looking over my shoulder to see if he was following me. But the hallway was empty. He hadn't come after me. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, hitting the button for the lobby, my hand shaking so badly I could barely press it. When the doors closed, I let out a shaky breath, my whole body trembling with fear. I didn't stop running until I reached the front desk. The clerk looked up, startled by the sight of me, disheveled, barefoot, and clearly terrified. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words came out in a rush, barely making sense. They called security, but by the time they reached my room, the man was gone. There was no sign of him, no trace that he'd ever been there. The door was locked, the room untouched, but I knew what had happened. I could still feel the bruises on my arm where he'd grabbed me, still hear his cold, emotionless voice telling me he knew who I was. I left the hotel that night, checked out early, and never looked back. I still don't know who he was or how he knew my information, but I'll never forget the way he looked at me, like I was just a piece of a plan he'd been working on for a long time. And I'll never forget how close I came to not making it out. It was one of those nights where I just wanted to get home. You know the feeling when you're out somewhere, it's late, and all you can think about is just getting back to your own bed. I'd been driving for hours already. The route I was on wasn't one I'd normally take, but it was the quickest way home, so I figured it'd be fine. Mostly open road, barely any traffic, nothing to slow me down. But that stretch of country road felt like it went on forever. It was dark, really dark. No street lights, and the moon was barely peeking through the clouds. My headlights were the only thing cutting through the night, and even they didn't seem to be doing much. Just fields on either side, trees in the distance, and the occasional farmhouse set way back from the road. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like an hour, maybe longer. I had the radio on low, but it wasn't doing much to keep me awake. The isolation started to mess with me, like I was the only person left in the world, just driving through the middle of nowhere. I kept thinking how weird it was that I hadn't passed anyone in so long, but I brushed it off. It was late. Maybe this road wasn't used much at night. I was just starting to get comfortable, telling myself it was just another boring drive, when out of nowhere, I saw headlights in the distance ahead of me. They were coming from a side road, and I figured it was just another car finally showing up. But as I got closer, something felt off. The car didn't merge onto the road like I expected. It stopped right at the intersection, then slowly pulled out in front of me, blocking the entire road. I had to slam on my brakes. The screech of my tires cut through the silence, my heart pounding in my chest. The car didn't move, didn't speed up, nothing. It just sat there, right in the middle of the road, as if the driver had been waiting for me. I was mad at first. I mean, who does that? But then that feeling hit me. I got instinct that something was wrong. The other car's windows were tinted, so I couldn't see inside. And there was no movement, no sign that whoever was in there was trying to fix a problem, or anything like that. They were just sitting there, blocking the road. I honked. Just a quick beep, trying not to make a big deal out of it, but enough to let them know I was there. No response. I honked again, this time longer. Still nothing. The road was narrow, and with the ditches on either side, there wasn't any room for me to go around. I was stuck there, staring at this car, and it wasn't budging. Then the headlights behind me flicked on. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was, another car. It had pulled up behind me so quietly I hadn't even noticed. Its headlights were blinding in the mirror, but that wasn't what made my stomach drop. It was the fact that as soon as I looked back, the car's lights turned off. Complete darkness again. I sat there, frozen. My brain was trying to make sense of what was happening. I was sandwiched between these two cars, one in front of me and one behind, and neither of them was moving. I couldn't see the driver behind me. I couldn't see anyone. The air in the car felt thick, heavy, like I couldn't breathe properly. I reached for my phone, but when I glanced down, I realized I had no signal. Of course I didn't. Out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields, no cell towers for miles. I felt that familiar knot of fear tighten in my chest. I was about to try honking again, when the door of the car in front of me slowly opened. A man stepped out, but I couldn't see his face. He stood there for a moment, just a silhouette against the headlights, before he started walking toward my car. My heart was racing now. Everything in me screamed to hit the gas, to push past him, but the way he was walking, slow, deliberate, it unnerved me. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't scared. He was in control. He got closer, and that's when I saw he was holding something. It looked like a pipe or a crowbar, but I couldn't be sure. My mouth went dry. My hands were gripping the steering, well, so tight my knuckles were white. He reached the front of my car and just stood there, staring. I still couldn't make out his face in the darkness, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching me, waiting. I didn't know what to do. I kept looking back in the mirror, but the car behind me stayed dark. No movement, no lights, just sitting there like a predator waiting for its moment. I felt trapped, like a mouse caught between two tats, and they were both just playing with me. The man in front took a step closer, raising whatever he was holding. That's when I snapped. I wasn't going to wait to find out what he wanted. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching again as I backed up as fast as I could. The car behind me didn't move, not at first. But as soon as I started backing up, its headlights flicked on again. My stomach twisted, and I knew I had to make a choice. If I tried to go around the car behind me, I'd end up in the ditch, but I couldn't stay where I was. I didn't think. I just acted. I slammed the car into drive and floored it. The man in front barely had time to react before I swerved to the side, my tires skimming the edge of the ditch. I felt the car lurch, but I kept my foot on the gas, praying I wouldn't flip. I shot past him, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't look back, didn't check to see what the car behind me was doing. I just kept driving. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel steady. After what felt like forever, I saw headlights in the distance, coming toward me from the opposite direction. It was the first car I'd seen since this whole thing started. I flashed my eye beams, hoping they'd stop, but they just drove right past, oblivious to what had just happened. I didn't stop driving until I saw the lights of a gas station up ahead. I pulled in, my entire body shaking as I parked in front of the brightly lit building. I sat there for a minute, trying to catch my breath, my hands still gripping the wheel. I looked around, half expecting to see the cars following me, but they were gone. It was just me sitting in that gas station parking lot, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I never figured out who they were or what they wanted. Maybe they were trying to rob me, maybe worse. But I got lucky. I made it out. I haven't taken that road since, and I don't plan to. It started small, almost too small to even notice at first. I'm a pretty private person at work, you know? I come in, do my job, and go home. I've always kept my personal life separate from my work life. But lately it felt like there was someone watching a bit too closely. His name was Mike. He worked in the office down the hall, but we didn't really interact much beyond the usual pleasantries in the break room. He was quiet, always kept to himself, so I didn't think much of him. But then, out of nowhere, he started asking these strange questions. At first, it was stuff like, "What are you doing this weekend?" or "Where do you like to hang out after work?" Innocent enough, right? But then it got more specific. "Where do you live, by the way, or do you live alone?" That one really caught me off guard. I laughed it off, tried to steer the conversation in another direction, but he kept pushing. "You must live in a nice neighborhood. You seem like someone who'd have a good setup at home." I brushed it off, told myself he was just making small talk, maybe being a little awkward. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, I was leaving work later than usual. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few cars, including Mike's. I didn't think much of it until I noticed him standing near the entrance, leaning against the wall like he was waiting for someone. When he saw me, he waved, smiled, and started walking toward me. "Late night," he said, like we were old friends. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my voice casual, but my guard was up, just trying to catch up on some things. He nodded, but instead of walking to his car, he just stood there, watching as I unlocked mine. "You want some company? Maybe grab a drink after work." I hesitated. This was getting weird. I didn't want to be rude, but something about his tone, the way he was looking at me, made me uneasy. "No thanks," I said. "I'm just gonna head home." He didn't say anything else, just stood there watching as I got into my car and drove away. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about how strange that interaction had been. I told myself I was overreacting, that he was probably just being friendly. But then it started happening more often. He'd show up outside my office when I wasn't expecting him, asking about my plans, what I was doing after work, if I wanted to grab a coffee. I kept saying no, trying to keep it polite, but firm. I didn't want to give him the wrong idea, but the more I pushed him away, the more persistent he became. One morning, I came into the office, and there was a note on my desk. No name, just a short message that said we should hang out sometime. I think we get along really well. I knew it was from him. The handwriting matched his, and the way it was written felt like the way he talked to me. It was unsettling, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I crumpled up the note and threw it away, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. I started noticing him more and more. Not just at work, but outside of it. I'd be walking to my car, and I'd catch a glimpse of him in the parking lot, just sitting in his car watching. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but then one night, as I was leaving the grocery store, I saw him again. He was standing by the entrance, watching as I loaded my groceries into my car. I froze for a second, unsure of what to do. He didn't approach me this time, but he didn't have to. The way he just stood there, staring, sent a chill down my spine. I got in my car as fast as I could and drove home, heart pounding the whole way. That's when I knew something was really wrong. This wasn't just a coincidence. He was following me. I started being more careful, looking over my shoulder when I left work, checking my rearview mirror on the way home. But no matter how much I tried to shake the feeling, he was always there, lurking in the background. One evening, after another long day at work, I got home and locked the door behind me. I had just started to relax when I heard a noise outside my apartment. It was subtle, just a shuffle of footsteps, but it was enough to set off alarm bells in my head. I peeked through the peephole and felt my stomach drop. It was Mike. He was standing outside my door, looking down at his phone, like he was waiting for something. I stepped back from my heart racing. How the hell did he know where I lived? I hadn't told anyone at work my address, and I certainly hadn't told him. I felt trapped, panicked, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? Confront him? I decided to wait it out, hoping he would leave. But after what felt like an eternity, he knocked. It wasn't a loud knock, more like a tap, like he didn't want to draw too much attention. I didn't answer. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, barely breathing, hoping he'd give up. But he didn't. He knocked again, a little louder this time. "I know you're in there," he called out. I just wanted to talk. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, dialing 911. The operator's voice was calm as I explained the situation, but I could hear the fear in my own voice. I kept my eyes on the door, terrified that he might try to break in. "I'll send someone over right away," the operator assured me. Mike knocked again, harder this time. "Come on," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "Don't make this difficult." I was paralyzed with fear, but the sound of distant sirens snapped me out of it. I could hear them getting closer, and for the first time that night, I felt a small glimmer of hope. Mike must have heard them too, because suddenly the knocking stopped. I crept back to the peephole and saw him walking away, disappearing down the stairs just as the sirens pulled up outside my building. The police arrived, and I told them everything. They took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. Mike hadn't technically broken any laws, and he was nowhere to be found by the time they got there. They advised me to get a restraining order, but they couldn't guarantee it would keep him away. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise, every creak of the floor made me jump. I kept expecting to hear another knock on door, to see his face through the peephole. The next day, I went to HR at work and told them everything. They took it seriously, thankfully, and said they'd handle it. Mike didn't show up to work that day, and I didn't see him again after that. But the fear didn't go away. I changed my routine, stopped going to the same places, stopped trusting the people around me. Even now, months later, I still look over my shoulder, still double-check that my doors are locked. It was a little after midnight when I left the bar. I don't usually stay out that late, but I had met up with some old friends I hadn't seen in a while. Time just got away from us, and before I knew it, the streets were empty, and the buses had stopped running. My apartment wasn't too far, though. A quick walk, maybe 20 minutes at most, and I'd be home. The streets were quiet, just the way they usually are around that time. A couple of distant cars, the occasional hum of someone's TV through an open window, but mostly just empty sidewalks and closed shops. I wasn't really paying attention to much, just walking and thinking about getting home to crash for the night. But then maybe 10 minutes into the walk, I noticed something that made me stop. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my own steps bouncing off the buildings, but it was too steady, too deliberate. I slowed down, and they slowed too. I picked up the pace, and sure enough, they sped up right along with me. I glanced over my shoulder, not wanting to be obvious about it. There was someone behind me, about 50 feet back, just barely visible in the dim streetlights. I couldn't make out any details, just a shape, a person, walking at the same pace as me, not trying to overtake me, but not falling behind either. I kept walking, my heart picking up speed with each step. I told myself not to panic. It's a public street, people walk late at night all the time, right? Maybe they just happened to be going the same way. I tried to shrug it off and focus on getting home, but no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the footsteps stayed with me. Every corner I turned, every change in speed, they were there, right behind me. I could feel the tension building in my chest, a creeping sense of unease that I couldn't shake. It was like having someone's eyes on the back of my neck, even though I didn't want to look back. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped in my tracks, turning around to confront whoever it was. The street was empty. No one was there. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the spot where I was sure I had seen someone only seconds before. My heart was pounding, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Maybe they had ducked into a side street or behind a parked car. But the whole block was open, no alleys or places to hide. It didn't make sense. I turned back around, ready to keep walking, but then I saw them. They were ahead of me now, standing in the middle of the sidewalk about 20 feet away, just watching. My stomach dropped. There was no way they could have gotten there that fast. No way they could have passed me without me seeing. I took a step back, and they took a step forward. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to run, but something in the way they moved made me freeze. It wasn't right. People don't move like that. It was too smooth, too deliberate, almost like they were gliding. I forced myself to move, to break out of the shock. I turned and walked as fast as I could in the opposite direction, not daring to look back this time. My legs felt heavy, my breath was coming too fast, but I just kept moving. I could hear my own footsteps echoing off the buildings, and I kept waiting for the sound of theirs to catch up again, but it never came. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw that they were gone again, just like before, vanished without a trace. The street behind me was empty, like I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew I hadn't. I felt it, the way you feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain hits. There was something wrong about this. I turned back around, and there they were again, ahead of me, closer this time. I froze. My mouth went dry, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. They didn't move either, just stood there, blocking the way forward. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice sounding more desperate than I wanted it to. No answer. I took a step to the side, and so did they. I tried to go the other way, but they mirrored my movements exactly. It was like they were a shadow, locked onto me, refusing to let me pass. I was trapped. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but nothing made sense. There was no reason for this, no explanation that fit. It felt like a nightmare, one of those dreams where you try to scream, but no sound comes out, where you try to run, but your legs won't move. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at them, my heart pounding in my ears. Time felt like it was stretching, like the world had stopped turning. Then, without warning, they took a step toward me. That broke the spell. I turned and bolted, running as fast as I could down the street. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I could feel them behind me, even though I didn't dare look back. The street lights flickered past in a blur, and all I could think about was getting somewhere safe. I rounded a corner and saw a gas station up ahead, its neon sign buzzing in the distance. I sprinted toward it, my whole body shaking with fear and exhaustion. I burst through the doors, gasping for breath, and the cashier looked up from his magazine, startled. "You okay, man?" he asked, his eyes widening as he took in my disheveled appearance. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, leaning against the counter, trying to catch my breath. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see them standing there, but the street outside was empty. It didn't make sense. They couldn't have just disappeared, but they were gone, like they had never been there at all. I stayed in that gas station for what felt like hours, too scared to go back outside. Eventually, I called a friend to come pick me up. I didn't tell them what happened, just that I needed a ride. I couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words that didn't sound crazy. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And every time I walk down that street now, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see them again. Whoever or whatever they were, I haven't seen them since that night. But I'll never forget the way they moved, the way they seemed to vanish and reappear like they were playing some twisted game. It's like they were waiting for me, following me, but only when I wasn't looking. And the worst part is, I'll never know why. I moved into the house about 2 months ago. It was just me and my dog, Bella, in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. It wasn't the best area, but the rent was cheap, and I liked the backyard. There was this old shed-up back that came with the place. It looked like no one had used it in years, covered in ivy and a rusted padlock hanging from the door. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. I figured it was probably full of old junk, nothing useful. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I spent most of my time fixing up the inside of the house, painting, unpacking, getting settled. Bella loved running around the yard, and every now and then she'd wander over to sniff at the shed, but I didn't think much of it. Then about a week ago, I started hearing strange noises at night. At first, I thought it was just the wind or animals. We get raccoons and stray cats around here sometimes. But then, the sounds became more distinct. It wasn't animals. It was like someone moving around out there. Shuffling. A low scraping noise, like something was being dragged across the ground. I tried to ignore it. I'd close the blinds, turn up the TV, and pretend it wasn't happening. But every night, the noises would start again, and Bella would sit by the back door, growling low in her throat. One night, I finally decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and went out into the yard. The air was cool, and everything was quiet, except for the soft rustling of leaves. I stood there for a minute, just listening, waiting for something. But nothing happened. No sound, no movement. I shined the flashlight toward the shed, and that's when I saw the padlock wasn't hanging on the door anymore. It was lying on the ground, broken. My heart started racing. Someone had been inside. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the shed, frozen. Bella was right beside me, growling and pacing. I don't know what made me do it, but I walked toward the shed. My hand was shaking as I reached for the door handle. I pulled it open, and the smell hit me first. It was this strong, musty smell, like mold and something rotting. I gagged and took a step back, shining the flashlight inside. There, in the corner, was a man. He was crouched down, his arms wrapped around his knees, staring at me with wide, wild eyes. His clothes were filthy, and his hair was greasy, hanging in matted clumps. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, holding the flashlight on him. He was the first one to break the silence. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice hoarse like he hadn't spoken in a while. "I've just been staying here. I didn't think anyone lived here." My mind was racing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This man had been living in my shed right behind my house for God knows how long. "How long have you been here?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Couple weeks, maybe," he said, rubbing his face with his dirty hand. I didn't have anywhere else to go. I didn't know what to say. My mouth went dry, and I felt like my legs were going to give out. I wanted to run back into the house, lock the doors, and call the cops, but something about the way he looked at me, like he was scared too, kept me standing there. "Why? Why here?" I finally managed to ask. He shrugged, looking down at the ground. The place was empty. I was just passing through, saw the shed, figured it was better than sleeping on the street. I didn't mean to scare you. I didn't know what to believe. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but the other part of me, the part that had been hearing those noises for days, the part that it felt like someone was watching me, was terrified. "You need to leave," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice was still shaky. "You can't stay here." He looked up at me, and for a second, I thought he was going to argue, but then he just nodded, slowly standing up. He was taller than I thought, his clothes hanging off his skinny frame. I took a step back as he moved toward the door. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll go. I'm sorry." I watched as he shuffled out of the shed, his head down, shoulders hunched. I didn't follow him. I didn't want to get too close. He walked past me, heading for the fence at the back of the yard. I stayed there, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white, until he was out of sight. When I finally went back inside, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one. Bella was still growling, pacing by the back door. I couldn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak made my heart race. I kept thinking about that man, the way he looked at me. I didn't know if he was telling the truth, or if he was dangerous, or what he was really doing in my shed. The next morning, I went out to the shed again. The smell was still there, lingering in the air. I stepped inside, holding my breath. There was a pile of old blankets in the corner, along with some empty cans and bottles. It looked like he'd been living there for a while. I don't know how I hadn't noticed sooner. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That a homeless man had been squatting in my shed? He was gone now, and I didn't even know where he went. Maybe he really was just passing through. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still around, watching. I kept hearing things at night, footsteps, whispers. I'd look out the window, but I never saw anything. Bella seemed on edge too, barking at nothing, staring out into the yard like she could see something I couldn't. One night, I heard it again, the sound of something moving outside. My heart started pounding in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the back door, peeking through the blinds. There was nothing out there, just the shed, standing in the dark, its door slightly ajar. I should have called the cops. I should have done something. But instead, I went outside again, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal. The yard was quiet, too quiet. Bella followed me, growling softly, her ears perked up. I walked over to the shed, my stomach in knots. The door was open, just a crack. I reached for it, my hand shaking, and pulled it open. The man was inside again. He was sitting in the same corner, his knees pulled up to his chest, staring at me. But this time, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, watching me with those same wild eyes. "I told you to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. He didn't move. "I'm calling the police," I said, backing away. "You need to go." That's when he stood up, slowly towering over me. My heart was racing, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. He took a step toward me, and that's when I saw it, the knife in his hand. It was small but sharp, glinting in the light from my flashlight. "Please," he said, his voice low and desperate. "I don't want to hurt you, but I can't leave." "Not yet." I didn't wait to hear what he was going to say next. I turned and ran, sprinting back to the house with Bella barking at my heels. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it and grabbing my phone. I called the police, my hand shaking so badly I could barely dial. They came within minutes, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. They searched the shed, the yard, the whole neighborhood, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had disappeared into thin air. I haven't seen him since, but every night, I still hear those noises. And every time I look out into the yard, I can't help but feel like someone's watching me. I was driving through the desert late one evening, heading back home after a long day of work. The sun was setting, casting those long shadows across the empty road. It was one of those stretches where you could drive for hours without seeing another car. My phone was out of service, and the only sound was the hum of my engine and the occasional gust of wind. As I rounded a bend, I saw a car parked on the side of the road. At first, I thought it might be a mirage. The car was old, covered in dust, and the paint was chipped. It didn't look like it had been moved in a while. I pulled over, thinking someone might need help. It wasn't the best idea to stop out here, but I couldn't just drive by. I got out of my car and walked toward the abandoned vehicle. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, and the interior was in shambles. Papers and empty cans were scattered across the seats. I knocked on the window, but there was no response. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" Just as I was about to get back in my car and leave, I heard a noise from behind me. I spun around, and that's when I saw a man emerging from the shadows. He looked rough, with unkempt hair and a disheveled appearance. His clothes were dirty, and his eyes were wild. I didn't know what to make of him. He came towards me quickly, and I could see something in his hand, glinting in the fading light. I instinctively took a step back, feeling my heart race. "Hey, I'm just trying to help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't say a word. Instead, he lunged at me, and that's when I saw a knife. I didn't have time to think. I spun around and ran back to my car, my legs feeling like they were moving in slow motion. I could hear his footsteps behind me getting closer. I fumbled with my keys, trying to get the door open. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped them. I finally got the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked the doors and started the engine, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man running toward my car, his face twisted in anger. He was close, but I managed to pull away just in time. I sped down the road, not daring to look back. The desert was a blur of dark shapes and shadows. The rest of the drive was a blur of adrenaline. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights chasing me. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. When I finally got there, I pulled into a gas station and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I called the police and reported the incident. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but by the time they got there, I knew the man would be long gone. I didn't get much sleep that night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I haven't stopped to help anyone on the side of the road since then. It's a lesson I won't forget. The desert can be a lonely, unforgiving place, and sometimes it's better to keep driving. I work as a food delivery driver, and one night, I was assigned a delivery to an apartment complex on the edge of town. It was late, and I'd already been on the road for hours. The complex was one of those older buildings with dim lighting and long, shadowy hallways. I found the apartment, delivered the food, and got a tip. As I walked back to my car, I noticed it was unusually quiet. The only sounds were my footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot. I glanced around, feeling the chill of the night, and shook off the uneasy feeling that had started to creep in. Just as I reached my car, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, but the lot was empty. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I unlocked my car and was about to get in when I heard the footsteps again, this time closer. I turned around quickly, and that's when I saw a man in a hoodie standing a few feet away. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I tried to act calm. "Can I help you?" I asked, hoping he'd go away. The man didn't say anything. Instead, he started walking toward me, his movements fast and purposeful. I backed up instinctively, my hand still on my car door. As I reached for my phone to call for help, the man reached out and grabbed the handle of my car. I tried to yank it away, but he was stronger and seemed determined. Panic surged through me. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, but he wasn't letting go. I could feel the door straining against his grip. I shouted, "Let go. I'll call the police," but he only tightened his hold. I managed to pull the car door shut, locking it with a quick twist of the key. I could see him through the window now, his face a mask of frustration and anger. He pounded on the glass with his fist, and I was terrified he might break through. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I gave the dispatcher the address and described the situation as best as I could, my voice trembling. The man, seeing me on the phone, seemed to realize that the police were on their way. He let go of the car handle and stepped back, still staring at me with that unsettling glare. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the parking lot. I stayed in my car, my heart racing, until the police arrived. They checked the area, but didn't find him. They took my statement and assured me they'd keep an eye on the complex. I was a mess by the time I drove away. My hands were still shaking, and I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my head. I finished my shift, but I was on edge the entire time, constantly checking my rearview mirror. I've made a habit of being extra cautious since that night. I no longer make deliveries to that part of town alone, and always keep my car doors locked. The whole experience made me realize how quickly things can go wrong, even in a job that seems so routine. I was riding the bus home from a late shift at work, the kind where you get off in the dead of night. The streets were empty, and the bus was mostly deserted, except for a few scattered passengers. I was tired and ready to get home, so I just kept my head down and stared at my phone, hoping the ride would pass quickly. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting across the aisle a few rows back and kept glancing over at me. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but his staring was intense, and it was starting to make me uneasy. I looked up once, and he quickly looked away, but I could still feel his eyes on me. When the bus made its final stop and I got off, he followed me. I tried to ignore it, hoping he was just heading the same way, but he trailed behind me at a distance. I quickened my pace, and so did he. My heart started to race. I turned onto a side street, hoping to lose him, but he stayed right behind me. I picked up my speed, but the sound of his footsteps was still there, getting closer. I glanced back and saw him in the dim light of the street lamp. He was close enough now that I could make out his face, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and a vacant look in his eyes. I tried to stay calm. I thought about crossing the street and heading into a well-lit area, but it felt like the right decision was slipping away. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, dialing 911 just in case. I kept the phone in my hand, but I didn't want to look like I was panicking. The man finally spoke. "You don't need to run," he said, his voice calm but unsettling. "I just want to talk to you." I stopped in my tracks, trying to steady my breathing. "Who are you? Why are you following me?" I asked, trying to sound assertive. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with an intensity that made me shiver. "I know where you work," he said finally. "I know what time you get off. I know your name is Daniel." My blood ran cold. "How do you know that?" I demanded, but his response was only a faint smile. I backed away, my hand still gripping the phone. "Stay away from me. I'm calling the police." He didn't move, but he seemed to be weighing his options. I could see the street up ahead, where there were more people and better lighting. I turned and started walking quickly toward it, trying to stay in sight of anyone who might be around. I could hear him following me, but he was keeping a distance now, as if he was letting me lead the way. When I reached the street with more people, I stopped and looked back. He was still there, but he seemed to realize that following me in a more populated area was too risky. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of the night. I called the police once I was sure he was gone. They took down my report and promised to keep an eye out. They said they'd send someone to check the area, but I wasn't sure how much they could do. I made it home safe that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whole experience left me on edge. I've been extra cautious since then, avoiding the same bus route and trying to stay aware of my surroundings. I know it sounds like a scene from a thriller, but it was real, and it shook me up more than I cared to admit. It all started about a month ago. I moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, thinking it would be a peaceful place to settle in. The area seemed quiet, and the neighbors were friendly enough, or so I thought. It was the kind of place where you didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. One afternoon, I checked my mailbox and found a note inside. It was handwritten, and the message was simple: "I'm watching you." At first, I thought it was a prank or maybe a note from one of the neighbors. I shrugged it off and went about my day, but then it happened again. Another note showed up a few days later. This one was more detailed. It said, "I saw you at the grocery store yesterday. You looked nice." I remember the date clearly because I had been wearing a bright red dress, and I found it odd that someone would remember it. I began to feel uneasy. I reported the notes to the police, but they just said to be cautious and let them know if anything else happened. They didn't seem too concerned. I didn't know what else to do, so I kept my guard up and continued my daily routines. A week later, I received another note. This one was even more unsettling. It said, "You were out late last night. I hope you enjoyed your walk." The detail about my late night walk made my stomach drop. I always took a walk after dinner to unwind, but I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. The idea that someone knew this much about my private life was chilling. I went back to the police, and again they told me there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. They seemed dismissive, which only made me more anxious. I started checking my locks more frequently, and even considered installing security cameras, but I was afraid of making a fuss and drawing more attention to myself. The notes kept coming. Each one was more intrusive than the last. They would mention specific things about my daily life, like why I went to the gym or how I picked up a package from the front desk. It felt like I was being stalked, but without any clear signs or proof, I felt helpless. One evening, I came home to find another note in my mailbox. It was the most disturbing one yet. It read, "I saw you talking to your friend today. It's nice that you have someone to talk to, but they can't protect you forever." The mention of my friend, who I had only seen once or twice, made me panic. I felt like my privacy was being completely invaded. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept every light on, and made sure all the doors were locked. I stayed up, listening for any sounds or movements outside. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I felt like I was losing control of my own life. The next day, I decided to take a different route to work and avoid any routine I had established. I hoped that by changing my habits, I could throw off whoever was watching me. It wasn't long before I noticed a strange car parked near my apartment, but I didn't see anyone inside. Finally, I got fed up with the police's lack of response and went directly to the local precinct. I demanded to speak with a detective and showed them all the notes. The detectives seemed to take it more seriously, and they agreed to start an investigation. They took my report, looked into the car I had seen, and promised to increase patrols around my apartment. A few days later, I noticed a significant decrease in the number of notes. I don't know if the police's actions had scared the person off or if they had just stopped for another reason, but I was relieved. I continued to be cautious, but the constant fear began to fade. Eventually, the notes stopped completely. I still don't know who was sending them or why, but I learned to trust my instincts more and not to be afraid to seek help. Even though the situation was resolved, the experience left me wary and more aware of my surroundings. I still live in the same apartment, but now I take extra precautions and make sure to keep my life as private as possible. A few months ago, I needed to clear out my storage unit. I had been putting it off for a while because life got busy, but I finally decided it was time to sort through everything. The storage facility is in a pretty remote part of town, away from any real foot traffic. The place seemed quiet, and I hadn't had any issues before. It was a Saturday morning when I went to the facility. I had a few boxes and a couple of furniture pieces that I wanted to get rid of. When I arrived, the place was empty. I used my key and code to get into the storage unit area, and I drove up to my assigned unit. I had rented this unit a few years ago, so the routine was familiar. I opened the door to my unit and started moving things around. It was a small space, just big enough for a few pieces of furniture and some boxes. I was alone, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of boxes as I shifted them around. I was making good progress when I heard a faint noise from outside. It sounded like a door closing, but I didn't think much of it. After a while, I took a break and sat on a box, checking my phone for a moment. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of a lock clicking shut. I looked up and noticed the light outside the unit had dimmed. That was when I realized the door to my unit was locked from the outside. I immediately went to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I banged on it and shouted, but there was no response. My heart started pounding. I had no idea who could be doing this or why. I tried to use my phone to call for help, but there was no signal in the storage unit. Panic started to set in. I could feel the sweat forming on my forehead. I looked around for anything that could help me get out, but the unit was small and cramped. There were no tools or anything useful that I could see. Then I heard a soft, eerie laugh from outside. It was slow, almost as if it was trying to stay hidden. I froze and listened. The laughter stopped, but I could hear faint footsteps moving away from my unit. My breathing became shallow. I felt like I was being toyed with. I tried calling out again, hoping someone might hear me, but it felt pointless. I knew I had to stay calm and think. I checked the door again, trying to force it open, but it was no use. I pounded on the metal door with my fists, hoping that someone might hear me from outside. The metal echoed my desperate hits. As time passed, I started to hear more noises. The footsteps were back, and I could hear muffled voices talking, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. I felt trapped and isolated. The air in the unit seemed to get warmer, and it became harder to breathe. I noticed a small vent in the top corner of the door. It was too small for anyone to get through, but I managed to see a small portion of the hallway outside. I saw shadows moving, and I realized that there were more people out there. My mind raced, trying to figure out what their intentions were. Eventually, I heard the sound of keys jingling and a lock turning. The door swung open, and I was met with a man standing there, looking almost amused. He was alone, and I quickly realized that he was the one who had been messing with me. I wanted to scream at him, but I was too exhausted and scared. He explained that it was just a prank. He worked at the facility, and thought it would be funny to scare me a little. I was furious and scared, but I was just relieved to be out. I demanded to know why he thought this was acceptable, and he just shrugged it off, saying he didn't think it would go that far. I left the storage facility that day feeling shaken. I reported the incident to the management, and made sure they knew how unsettling and dangerous the whole thing was. I'm not sure if anything came of it, but I haven't been back to that storage unit since. The whole experience left me more cautious and aware of my surroundings. I still think about that day, and how close I came to being completely alone and vulnerable. Last month, I had a terrifying experience that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. I was at home one evening, just relaxing after a long day, when my phone rang. It was an unknown number, and I hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was frantic. They told me my husband had been in a car accident and was rushed to an emergency clinic nearby. I could barely process the words. I asked them for more details, but they hung up abruptly. My heart was racing as I threw on some clothes and rushed out the door. I drove to the clinic as fast as I could, my mind filled with worry. When I arrived, I ran to the reception desk, breathless and panicked. I told the nurse who was behind the counter about the call, and that my husband had been brought in. The nurse looked at me with confusion, and then began typing on her computer. After what felt like an eternity, she turned to me and said there was no record of anyone by my husband's name being admitted. I was shocked and demanded to see a doctor or anyone who could help me figure out where my husband was. The nurse tried to calm me down, but I felt a growing sense of dread. While I was standing there, trying to make sense of it all, a man approached me. He was middle-aged, wearing a worn-out jacket, and had a rough look about him. He said he had overheard my situation and offered to give me a ride. His demeanor was oddly calm, but there was something unsettling about his offer. I was desperate and just wanted to find my husband, so I considered the man's offer. However, something about him made me uneasy. I asked him if he knew anything about the accident or if he could help me in another way, but he just repeated his offer to drive me home. He didn't provide any more information or show any concern for the situation. I felt trapped between needing help and not wanting to accept an offer from a stranger. I tried to reach out to friends and family, hoping someone would be able to come and pick me up or help me find out what had happened. Meanwhile, the man stood outside, patiently waiting. I decided I had to be cautious. I told him I was waiting for someone I had called and that I would be fine. He seemed to get frustrated, but didn't push too hard. He gave me a strange look and walked away, but not before making a point to tell me that he would be around if I changed my mind. Eventually, my friend arrived and took me home. The whole experience left me feeling uneasy, and I couldn't shake the fear of what might have happened if I had accepted that man's offer. The next day, I managed to get in touch with local authorities and checked other hospitals. After a lot of searching, It turned out that the call I had received was a mistake or perhaps a cruel prank. My husband was perfectly fine and had been at home the whole time. I still don't know who that man was or why he was there. I wonder if he was somehow connected to the fake call or if he was just a stranger with ill intentions. The whole experience made me more cautious about accepting help from strangers and reminded me to always verify the information before taking any drastic actions. I had an unsettling experience last week that I can't shake from my mind. I was driving home from a late-night shift and my gas tank was running on empty. I was on this isolated stretch of highway and hadn't seen a gas station for miles. Finally, I spotted one in the distance, its lights barely flickering. I was relieved to have found a place to fill up. When I pulled in, I noticed the station was closed. The pumps were still operational, though, so I figured I could just fill up and be on my way. As I got out of my car, I saw a few guys hanging around near the building. They looked like they might be workers or maybe just loiterers. They were all standing close together, and their presence made me a bit uneasy, but I didn't think too much of it. I started pumping gas, trying to ignore the group. They were talking amongst themselves and occasionally glancing over at me. I kept my eyes on the pump, hoping they would just leave me alone. Then, one of them, a man in a worn-out jacket, approached me. He asked if I had any cash on me, saying that the station was closed and they weren't supposed to let people fill up. I told him I had a credit card and that I would be finished in a few minutes. He just nodded and walked away. A few minutes later, as I was about to finish up, the same guy came back, this time with the rest of the group following him. They started asking more questions. They wanted to know where I was headed, why I was out there so late, and if I had been drinking. I was starting to feel really uncomfortable. I tried to stay calm and polite, but I could sense that something was off. One of the men stood next to my car door and wouldn't let me open it. Another was leaning against the driver's side, and a third had positioned himself by the back of the car. I felt trapped. They were asking questions, but the way they were acting made me think they had no real intention of letting me leave easily. Their questions were getting more aggressive, and they started talking among themselves, occasionally glancing at me and then back at each other. I decided I needed to get out of there fast. I told them I had to go and tried to move towards my car door. That's when one of them, the one who had first approached me, raised his voice and said I wasn't going anywhere until they had checked my car. Panic set in. I could feel my heart racing. I knew I had to do something. I took a deep breath and tried to stay as calm as possible. I told them I would call the police if they didn't let me go. At that point, the group seemed to hesitate. One of them muttered something about it being too risky. They looked at each other, and the tension was palpable. Finally, one of them stepped aside and told me I could leave, but warned me not to come back. I quickly got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was well past the gas station and in a more populated area. I reported the incident to the police when I got home, but they said there wasn't much they could do since they didn't have any concrete evidence or description of the men. I haven't driven that way since, and I make sure to check gas stations are open before stopping. It was a terrifying reminder of how quickly things can go wrong and how important it is to trust your instincts. I still feel uneasy every time I drive late at night and pass any gas station, always checking to make sure it's safe before I stop. It's been a while since I've talked about this, but the memories are still fresh, and I'm still trying to make sense of what happened. I had rented out a room in my townhouse to help with the mortgage. It seemed like a good idea at the time. The guy who moved in seemed normal enough at first. His name was Dave, and he had a steady job, which was reassuring. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. Dave was quiet and kept to himself. He paid his rent on time and never caused any trouble. But then things started to get odd. I'd come home from work, and sometimes I'd notice that the front door was slightly ajar. I figured I might have just forgotten to close it properly. Then I started seeing him in the hallways more often. He'd just stand there, almost like he was waiting for me to come by. When I asked him about it, he'd just say he was doing a bit of cleaning or organizing. I tried to let it slide, but my gut was telling me something wasn't right. I'd sometimes hear noises at night, like someone was moving around or dragging something heavy across the floor. When I'd ask Dave, he'd always have a reasonable explanation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. One evening, I got home from work late and was exhausted. I noticed the door to my own room was slightly open. I thought maybe I'd left it that way in my rush that morning. I went inside, and everything seemed in order, so I brushed it off. But the next day, I came home to find the front door locked. I knew I hadn't locked it, and the only key was with Dave. I knocked and rang the bell, but there was no response. After about 20 minutes, Dave finally opened the door, looking confused. I tried to keep things normal, but I felt more and more uneasy. It got to the point where I decided I had to do something about it. I talked to him about my concerns and asked him to move out. He was calm and said he'd leave as soon as he found a new place. I was relieved, but the unease didn't go away. A few days later, I came home and noticed something strange. The locks on all the doors in the house had been changed. I was locked out of my own room. I tried calling Dave, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I felt a wave of panic. I couldn't get into any of the rooms, and I didn't know where Dave was. I went outside and tried to get into the house through the windows, but he had them locked up tight. I decided to call a locksmith to get into my own room. It felt so violating to have to do that. While I was waiting, I saw Dave's car, and when the locksmith finally got the door open, I went straight to Dave's room. It was empty, and his stuff was gone. I called the police to report the situation. They said they couldn't do much since Dave had been a tenant and technically had the right to change the locks. They advised me to get a restraining order if he showed up again. I ended up changing all the locks in the house myself and installed some extra security measures to make sure it wouldn't happen again. I still don't know what exactly Dave's intentions were or why he acted the way he did. It was a terrible experience, and it took me a long time to feel comfortable in my own home again. I've learned to be much more cautious about who I let into my life and my space. When I first moved into the apartment, I thought I had locked out. It was my first time living on my own, and the place was cheap but clean. It had everything I needed: a decent-sized kitchen, a nice view of the city from the living room, and a bedroom that, while small, was cozy enough. It wasn't in the best part of town, but I didn't mind. I wanted my own space, and this was within my budget. For the first couple of weeks, things were fine. I was busy settling in, getting used to my new job, and figuring out the neighborhood. I didn't know many people, but I liked the quiet. The building was older, and the walls were thin, so I could hear my neighbors now and then, but it wasn't anything unusual. That's when I started to notice him. My apartment faced the street, and directly across from me was another unit. At first, I didn't pay much attention to the windows across from mine. The blinds were always drawn, and there was no sign of anyone living there. But one night, I came home late from work, and as I was getting ready for bed, I saw a figure standing by the window. He was just standing there, staring out at nothing. I couldn't see much of his face because the room behind him was dark, but I could tell it was a man. Something about the way he stood there, completely still, made me feel uneasy. I brushed it off as nothing. Maybe he was just someone who liked to look out the window at night. The next morning, I glanced over at the window again as I was making coffee, and he was still there. He hadn't moved. He was just standing there, staring out again like a statue. I tried not to think about it too much. People have weird habits, right? Maybe you worked out hours and just liked standing there. It wasn't until the third or fourth night that it really started to give to me. Every night, without fail, he was there. Always in the same spot, always staring out. At first, I tried to convince myself that he wasn't actually looking at me, just out at the street or something. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like his eyes were fixed on my window. I started closing my blinds at night, but even then, I could feel him. I'd be in bed, trying to sleep, and I'd get this overwhelming sense that he was watching. I'd check my door, make sure everything was locked, but that uneasiness never left. Then one night, I came home and found my front door unlocked. I always lock my door. Always. Living in that part of town, you couldn't be too careful. But when I got home that night, the door was slightly open. I froze in the hallway, my heart racing. I tried to remember if I'd forgotten to lock it that morning, but I knew I hadn't. I'm obsessive about things like that. I don't leave until I check the lock at least twice. I didn't want to go inside, but I didn't have a choice. It was my apartment, after all. I slowly pushed the door open, stepping inside. Nothing looked out of place. The furniture was where I left it, and there was no sign of anything missing. But that feeling, that sense of being watched, was stronger than ever. I went through the whole apartment, checking every room, every closet, even under the bed. There was no one there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. Maybe it was the neighbor. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After that, I started double-checking the locks, even putting a chair in front of the door at night. It wasn't enough, though. I still couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there in the window watching me. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It wasn't like he was actually dangerous, right? He was just a weird guy who never left his apartment. Maybe he had some kind of issue, something that kept him indoors. I tried to rationalize it, but every night the feeling got worse. One evening, I got home from work later than usual. It was raining, and the streets were empty. I hurried inside, drenched, and tossed my bag on the couch. I was about to grab a towel when I saw it. The blinds on the window across the street were open, and there he was, staring right at me. Not out at the street, not at the sky, but directly at my window. I froze, the towel slipping out of my hand. For the first time, I could see his face. Pale, gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed too big for his head. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. I backed away from the window, feeling my heart pound in my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off him, though. It was like I was trapped, held in place by his gaze. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I knew I had to do something. Maybe report him, but report him for what? Watching me from his own apartment? It wasn't illegal, but I couldn't live like this. I couldn't keep feeling like I was being watched all the time. The next day, I asked the building manager about the guy in the unit across from mine. She looked confused for a second before telling me that the apartment had been vacant for months. No one had rented it out since the last tenant moved out 6 months ago. I felt a chill run down my spine. That couldn't be right. I had seen him every night. Every single night, standing there watching me. I tried to argue, telling her that I had seen someone living there, but she just shook her head. "You must be mistaken. There's no one living there," she said. I didn't know what to think. Was I losing my mind? Was I seeing things that weren't there? I started to doubt myself, but deep down, I knew what I saw. That night, I locked the door, double-checked it, and even barricaded it with a chair. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for... I didn't know what. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. The sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, right outside my door. I held my breath, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, I heard the doorknob jiggle. I shot out of bed, grabbing my phone, ready to call the police. The door didn't open, though. Whoever was out there gave up after a few seconds, and the footsteps retreated down the hallway. I didn't sleep at all that night. First thing in the morning, I packed up my things and left. I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't care if I had to break the lease. I wasn't going to spend another night in that apartment. I moved out the next day, staying with a friend until I could find a new place. I never saw that man again, but sometimes late at night, I still feel like someone's watching me. I've been a long-haul truck driver for almost 5 years now. It's a tough job, but I like the freedom of the road. You get used to being alone, and most of the time, that's fine with me. You stop at truck stops, grab food, maybe chat with another driver if they seem friendly, then get back on the road. You learn to keep to yourself, especially at the more run-down places. This happened a few months ago, late one night, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I'd been driving for hours, making my way across a stretch of highway that didn't have much of anything, just fields, occasional gas stations, and a whole lot of darkness. It was around 2 a.m., and I was starting to get tired, so I figured I'd pull over at the next truck stop to rest for a bit, maybe grab a cup of coffee. I saw the sign for a stop a few miles up and took the exit. It was one of those small, isolated places, just a single gas station with a few pumps, a convenience store, and a couple of trucks parked out back. The kind of place you don't expect to see anyone, unless they're on the road too. I pulled my rig into the lot and parked near the back, away from the few cars that were parked near the entrance. As I stepped out of the cab, I noticed something odd right away. It was quiet, too quiet. Normally, even in the middle of the night, there's some kind of noise. Maybe a truck idling or someone talking. But here, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and my boots crunching on the gravel as I walked toward the store. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured it was late, and everyone was probably asleep. The lights inside the store were dim, and as I pushed open the door, a bell jingled overhead. There was a guy behind the counter, but he barely looked up when I came in, just glanced at me, then went back to whatever he was doing on his phone. I grabbed a cup of coffee, paid for it, and headed back outside. That's when I saw them. 3 men, standing near the far end of the parking lot by an old beat-up pickup truck. They weren't talking, just standing there, staring in my direction. At first, I thought maybe they were waiting for someone or just hanging out, but the longer I stood there, the more I realized they were watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself I was being paranoid. It was late, and I was tired. Maybe they were just truckers, same as me, waiting to hit the road. I took a sip of my coffee and started walking back to my truck. As I got closer, I noticed something else. One of the men had moved. He was standing closer now, about halfway between their truck and mine, like he'd been walking in my direction, but stopped when I noticed him. The other two stayed by the pickup, still watching. I didn't like the way they were looking at me. It wasn't the usual glance you get from people when they're curious or bored. This was different and tense, like they were sizing me up. I felt my heart start to race, but I tried to stay calm. I just needed to get back in my truck and lock the doors. I could be out of there in minutes if I kept my cool. But when I reached the door of my rig, I realized I'd left the driver's side door unlocked. I cursed under my breath, knowing I'd have to walk around to the other side to lock it from the inside. I didn't want to take my eyes off the men, but I had no choice. I circled around the truck as quickly as I could, and when I glanced back, the man who'd moved was even closer. He was walking toward me now, slow but deliberate. I yanked the passenger door open and scrambled inside, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked the driver's side door too. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, telling myself I was safe now that I was inside. But when I looked up, I saw that all three of them were standing right in front of my truck. They were just a few feet away, staring up at the cab like they were waiting for something. One of them, the tallest one, had a grin on his face, like he knew something I didn't. I fumbled with the keys, trying to get the engine started, but my hands were slick with sweat, and I kept dropping them. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Finally, I got the engine to turn over, and the headlights flicked on, illuminating the three men. They didn't move. I shifted into gear and started to pull forward, but one of the shorter men, stepped in front of the truck, blocking my path. I slammed on the brakes, not wanting to hit him, but he didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at me through the windshield, his face blank. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay there, but I couldn't drive through him either. The tall one started to walk toward the driver's door, and I could see he was holding something in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked sharp. My stomach dropped. I threw the truck into reverse, the tires screeching on the pavement as I backed up. The man in front of the truck stepped to the side, and I slammed my foot on the gas, pulling a hard turn to get out of there. The tall one ran toward the side of the truck, slamming his hand against the door as I sped away. I heard the thud of something metal hitting the side of the cab, but I didn't stop to look. I tore out of the parking lot, not caring if I was speeding, just wanting to put as much distance between me and them as possible. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel steady. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see their pickup truck following me. But there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching out behind me. I drove for a good hour before I finally pulled over at another truck stop, this one bigger and brighter, with other trucks parked outside and people milling around. I parked in the middle of the lot, where I could see everyone, and locked my doors before slumping back in my seat, trying to calm down. I sat there for a long time, thinking about what had happened. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to figure out if I'd done something to provoke them, but nothing made sense. They'd just been there waiting, watching, and that look on their faces, it wasn't random. It was like they were expecting me, like they knew I'd be there. I didn't report it. I didn't think the cops would believe me, and even if they did, what would they do? Those men were long gone by now. I just wanted to forget it and move on, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there somewhere, watching the roads, waiting for someone else to stop at that lonely truck stop in the middle of the night. My car broke down in the middle of nowhere. It was an old sedan, so it wasn't exactly a surprise, but it was still frustrating. I'd been driving for hours, trying to make it to the next town before dark, and I thought I could push it a bit further. Then the engine started sputtering, and before I knew it, the whole thing just died. There was nothing around me except fields, and I couldn't even see any houses. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The only thing I had going for me was a gas station I remembered seeing a few miles back. I grabbed my water bottle, locked the car, and started walking. It wasn't long before I reached the station. It was old, the kind that looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. There was a single pump in a small building with a sign that just said gas. I was hoping there'd be someone inside who could help me. The door creaked when I opened it, and inside, a guy sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He was in his 50s, maybe wearing creasy coveralls like he'd been working on cars all day. When he looked up, he smiled and asked what he could do for me. I explained my car had broken down a few miles away, and he nodded like it happened all the time. "You're in luck," he said. "I'm the mechanic here too. Let's take a look." We hopped into his truck, and he drove me back to my car. He seemed friendly enough, chatting about the weather and how quiet things were around here. When we got to the car, he popped the hood, poked around a bit, and then told me he'd need to tow it back to the station. He hooked it up to his truck, and we headed back. At first, I felt relieved that I'd found help so quickly. I figured I'd be back on the road in a couple of hours. But as we got back to the gas station, something started to feel off. He took the car around back to his garage, which was behind the station. I followed him inside, and that's when I realized how isolated this place really was. There were no other cars, no people coming and going, just us. The sun was starting to set, and the shadows around the station stretched out, making everything feel a little more sinister. He said the engine was pretty bad, and that it would take a while to fix. I asked if there was somewhere nearby I could stay for the night, and he just shook his head. "Not much around here," he said. "You're better off waiting here." That's when things started to change. He wasn't as friendly as before. His tone was different, a bit colder. I tried calling a tow service or another garage, but my phone still didn't have a signal. I asked if I could use his landline, and he told me it was down. "Storm knocked it out last week," he said. I started to feel trapped, but I didn't want to cause any trouble. I sat in the small waiting area inside the station, flipping through an old magazine while he worked on my car. The hours dragged on. I looked outside, and it was pitch black. I couldn't hear anything except the occasional clanging from the garage. At one point, I went out to check on him, and he snapped at me. "I told you, it's gonna take time," he said, not looking up from the engine. His face was different now, harder, meaner. I didn't like the way he was acting, but I didn't know what to do. My car was in pieces, and I was miles from anywhere. When I went back inside, I noticed something strange. There was a phone behind the counter. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood out. If the landline was down, why was it still there? I wanted to ask him about it, but something told me not to. As the hours passed, my anxiety grew. Every time I checked on the car, it seemed like he wasn't making any progress. In fact, it almost looked like he was undoing things, making the problem worse. I started to feel like he didn't want me to leave. At one point, I overheard him talking to someone on the phone in the back. It was muffled, but I caught enough to know he was lying to me. He had a working phone. He was telling someone that I was here, stuck. That's when I knew I had to get out. I waited until he went back to the garage, and then quietly went behind the counter to grab the phone. I was shaking, but I managed to dial 911. It rang twice before I heard a click, and then nothing. Just silence. No operator, no sound. I hung up and tried again. Same thing. It was like someone was intercepting the call. I looked out the window and saw him standing there, staring at me through the glass. He wasn't smiling anymore. He just watched me for a few seconds, then went back into the garage. I was panicking now. I didn't know who he was talking to, but it didn't feel right. I started looking for something I could use as a weapon, just in case. The only thing I found was a rusty tire iron near the front door. I sat there, clutching the tire iron, waiting. Every noise made me jump. The ticking of the old clock on the wall, the wind outside, it all felt too loud, too close. I didn't want to confront him, but I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. My only hope was that someone would come by the station and help. Hours passed, and no one came. It was well into the night when he finally came back inside. His hands were greasy, and his face was set in that same hard expression. "Car's gonna need a part one don't have," he said. "You're stuck here until I can get it." I knew he was lying. I could feel it in my gut, but I didn't say anything. I just nodded and told him I'd wait. He stared at me for a long time before walking out the door again. I watched as he disappeared into the darkness outside. That's when I made my move. I grabbed my bag and the tire iron and slipped out the back door. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. I ran into the night, through the fields behind the station, praying I wouldn't hear him coming after me. The darkness was suffocating. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, but I kept going, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how far I'd gotten when I heard a truck engine in the distance. I crouched down in the tall grass, holding my breath. The headlights of his truck swept across the field, searching. He was looking for me. I stayed as still as I could, my body trembling. The truck passed by, and I heard it drive off into the distance, but I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I got up and started walking again, staying off the road, cutting through fields and wooded areas. I walked for what felt like hours until I finally saw lights in the distance. It was another gas station, and this one had people. I stumbled inside, barely able to speak, but I told the clerk what had happened. They called the cops, and I waited for them to arrive. I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, looking for me. The police found my car back at the station, but the mechanic was gone. They told me they'd keep looking for him, but I never heard anything after that. I don't know why I went digging. I should have left it alone, but something about the way people were acting on the island didn't sit right with me. It all started when I was on vacation, taking a few weeks off work to get away from everything. I chose a small island, a place that wasn't crowded with tourists. The idea was to relax, maybe spend some time exploring the beaches, hiking, just to get a break from my everyday life. The island was beautiful. It was remote, and there weren't a lot of people. The locals seemed friendly at first, though they kept to themselves. I noticed that right away. They didn't seem too interested in talking to visitors, just doing their work and keeping out of sight. I figured they were just used to their quiet life and didn't want tourists disrupting things. I'd been there for about 3 days when I heard about the missing group. A couple of tourists had gone out on a boat trip and never came back. I overheard it from a couple staying at the same guest house as me. They said they'd seen the group the day before, all excited about going out on the water. Now nobody knew where they were. I didn't think much of it at first. Accidents happen, right? Maybe the boat broke down or they got lost. But the way the locals reacted when people started asking questions, it was strange. No one seemed worried. Not the guest house owners, not the people working at the restaurants, no one. It was like they didn't care. The authorities weren't any better. When the couple went to the local police, they came back frustrated. The police told them they were looking into it, but didn't seem too concerned. They said things like, people get lost out here all the time, or they'll turn up. They didn't even send out a search boat right away. That's when I started feeling like something was wrong. I mean, even if it's common for people to get lost, shouldn't they be doing more? I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, after dinner, I took a walk down to the docks where the boat rentals were. The place was deserted, but I noticed a few of the boats were missing. I figured one of them must have been the one the tourists had taken. There were no signs of anyone around, no activity, nothing. I went back to my room, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going over what I'd seen, the way everyone was acting. It felt like there was something they weren't telling us, something they knew that they didn't want us to know. The next morning, I decided to ask around a bit more, just to see if anyone else had heard anything. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I went into one of the little shops near the beach, a small place where they sold handmade souvenirs. The woman behind the counter barely looked at me when I asked if she'd heard about the missing tourists. She shrugged and said something like, "It happens." That was it. No concern, no questions. Just like that. It happens. I started walking around town, keeping my ears open, but no one was talking about it. It was like the whole thing had been swept under the rug, like they wanted to pretend it never happened. That afternoon, I went back to the docks again. This time, there was a man there, an older guy with a thick beard, working on one of the boats. I asked him if he knew anything about the missing group. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me for a long time before finally saying, "They're gone. Leave it alone." That's when the pit in my stomach started to grow. The way he said it, like it was a warning. He didn't offer any more information, just went back to his work. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to process what he'd said. "They're gone. Leave it alone." I went back to my guest house and tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it, that maybe this sort of thing just happened out here. But then I overheard something later that night. One of the guests was talking to someone on the phone, and they mentioned other people who had gone missing on the island in the past. It wasn't just this group. There had been others, tourists mostly, who had disappeared and were never found. Now I was really starting to worry. I tried looking up information on my phone, but there wasn't much about the island. It wasn't a big tourist destination, so there weren't a lot of reports or news stories. But the few things they did find were unsettling. There were rumors online, people talking about how they'd heard of others going missing, how the island had a history of people vanishing without a trace. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the island, away from the main tourist spots. I figured maybe I'd find something, I don't know, some clue, or at least get a better sense of the place. I walked for a few hours, following the dirt paths that led through the trees and along the coastline. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't see anyone else out there, no hikers, no locals, nothing. After a while, I came across a small clearing near the edge of the island where the trees opened up to a view of the water. That's where I found a pile of old weathered belongings. Backpacks, shoes, clothes, all piled up in a heap. Some of the stuff looked like it had been there for a while, faded and torn, but some of it looked newer, like it hadn't been there long. I felt sick. These weren't just random things. They belonged to people. People who had gone missing. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out at me, but there was no one. Just the sound of the wind and the waves in the distance. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, and I felt like I needed to get out of there. I started to back away when I heard something. Footsteps. I froze. They were coming from the behind me, slow and deliberate. I didn't wait to see who it was. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the ground as I pushed through the trees, branches scratching in my arms and face. I didn't stop until I was back at the main road. By the time I reached my guest house, I was out of breath, my clothes soaked with sweat. I went straight to my room, locked the door, and tried to calm myself down. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, following me. And now they knew I'd seen the pile. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, footsteps, the sound of someone moving around. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I wasn't safe here. The next morning, I packed my bags and left the guest house without telling anyone. I went straight to the ferry dock, but when I got there, the ferry wasn't running. They told me there was some kind of issue, that the next ferry wouldn't be for another 2 days. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay on the island, not after what I'd seen, but I didn't have a choice. I went to a different guest house, hoping that maybe I'd be safer there, that whoever had been watching me wouldn't know where I was. But that night, the noises started again. Footsteps outside my window, voices in the distance. I didn't dare look outside. I stayed in bed, clutching my phone, praying for the ferry to come. The next morning, I went down to the dock again. The ferry was there, thank God. I didn't waste any time. I bought my ticket and got on board, not looking back at the island. As the ferry pulled away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I don't know what's happening on that island, but I know one thing for sure: people are disappearing, and the locals know more than they're letting on. I don't think they're involved, not directly, but they're hiding something. They don't want outsiders digging too deep, asking too many questions. I've thought about going to the authorities, telling them what I saw, but I don't think it would do any good. No one would believe me. They'd say I was imagining things, that it was just a coincidence, that the island was perfectly safe. But I know the truth. Something is wrong on that island, and I'm just glad I got out when I did. I'd heard about the house from a guy at work. He said it had been empty for years. No one wanted to go near it, not even the town kids who like to break into places for fun. The house wasn't too far out of the way, just off a road that connected a few small towns. I figured I'd check it out. I wasn't the kind of guy who believed in ghosts or any of that. I just liked exploring old places, seeing what was left behind. It was a cold, gray afternoon when I went. The house stood alone, half hidden by trees that had grown wild around it. From the outside, it didn't look like much, just an old, 2-story house with peeling paint and windows boarded up in places. I didn't think too much about it at first. It looked like every other abandoned house I'd seen. I parked my car down the road a bit, so no one would see it and think I was up to something. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person around for miles. I didn't mind. It's part of what I liked about these trips. No one to bother you. The front door was locked, but the side door wasn't. It swung open with a groan, and I stepped inside. The air smelled musty like mold and old wood. Dust covered everything. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved through the hallway. I found the living room first empty, except for an old chair and a broken table. The windows were boarded up, but there was just enough light coming in through the cracks for me to see. There were stairs leading to the second floor, but I didn't go up right away. I wanted to check out the ground floor first. The kitchen was in the back, with cabinets hanging open. Some of the doors ripped off. There were no dishes, no food, just empty shelves and broken drawers. In the corner of the kitchen, I found a door that led down to the basement. It was dark, and the smell coming from down there was even worse than the rest of the house. I didn't go down. I'm not an idiot. Basements in places like this were never a good idea. So, I headed upstairs instead. The stairs creaked with every step, and for a second, I wondered if they'd give out under me. But they didn't, and soon enough, I was on the second floor. There were a few bedrooms up there, but most of them were empty, just old furniture, broken beds, and dusty floors. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I found the room. It was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and at first it looked like the rest empty, run down. But then I saw the walls. They were covered in posters. Missing person posters. Dozens of them. Maybe more. I couldn't count. They were all taped or pinned to the walls, overlapping in some places, some faded with age. Each one had a face and a name, along with the town they were from. Most of the towns were nearby, within an hour or two of the house. Some of the posters were newer, the paper still crisp, while others looked like they'd been there for years, yellowed and brittle. I took a step closer to one of the posters. It was a woman's face, smiling in the photo, but the look in her eyes was unsettling. Beneath her photo were the words missing, last seen in Havendale, 2015. I looked at another poster. A young boy, no older than 10, missing since 2018. They were all like the people who had disappeared from the surrounding towns, people I'd never heard about. Something about it didn't sit right with me. These weren't just old posters that had been forgotten. They were placed here, in this room, like some kind of twisted collection. I stepped back, trying to take it all in, when I heard something. A soft creak, like a footstep, coming from somewhere in the house. My heart skipped. I hadn't seen anyone when I came in, hadn't heard anything until now. I stood still, listening, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old houses like this made noise all the time. But something in the back of my mind told me I wasn't alone. I decided to leave. I didn't need to see any more. This wasn't just some abandoned house. Something was wrong here. I moved quickly, heading back down the stairs, but as I reached the front hallway I saw it. The front door, the one I'd tried and found locked, was open. Not wide open, just a crack, but enough for me to know someone else had been inside. My chest tightened. I wasn't alone. Someone had been in the house with me the whole time. I headed for the side door, the one I'd come in through, but when I got there it was shut tight. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked from the outside. My stomach dropped. Whoever was here, they'd locked me in. I backed away from the door, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I didn't have a weapon, didn't have a way to defend myself. All I had was my phone, but when I pulled it out, there was no signal. Figures, out here in the middle of nowhere. I went back to the living room, trying to think of a way out. The windows were all boarded up, and even if I could pry one open, it would take too long. I had the sinking feeling that whoever was out there was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. That's when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, coming from outside the house, circling around, slow and deliberate. They stopped right outside the front door. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't know what to do. I stood there frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then the footsteps started up again, moving away from the door. I didn't wait to see where they were going. I bolted for the kitchen and tried the back door. Locked. Of course. I grabbed a chair and threw it at one of the boarded-up windows. The wood cracked, but didn't break. I hit it again, harder this time, and finally the boards gave way. I climbed through the opening, scraping my hands on the splintered wood, and dropped down into the overgrown backyard. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if someone was watching me from the house. I just ran. I ran through the yard, through the trees, not stopping until I reached the road where I'd parked my car. My legs were burning, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. But I managed to get the door open and started the engine. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away, back on the main road. I don't know who was in that house or what they wanted, but I have a feeling they knew I'd seen the room, the posters. I don't know what they were planning to do, but I didn't stick around to find out. I never reported it. I didn't want to get involved. I just wanted to forget the whole thing, but I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see those faces on the walls. And I know whoever was in that house, they're still out there. I was on my way back from a work trip, just driving down this long stretch of highway, trying to stay awake. It was one of those roads where you could go for miles without seeing anything but trees and more trees. No towns, no gas stations, just emptiness. I'd been driving for hours and figured it'd be smart to pull over at the next rest stop to stretch my legs, maybe grab a snack from the vending machine. It was late, around 10:30 p.m., maybe closer to 11, but I wasn't in a rush. The rest stop appeared out of nowhere, just this little patch of pavement with a few empty cars and some dim lights. I pulled in, parking close to the building, so I could use the bathroom. When I got out of the car, I noticed the place felt deserted. There were 2 other cars parked there, but no one in sight. The vending machines hummed quietly, and the street lights flickered like they hadn't been replaced in a while. I wasn't too concerned though, just focused on getting in and out. As I walked toward the building, I heard someone running behind me. My heart jumped and I spun around. It was this young girl, maybe 14 or 15, sprinting toward me from the far side of the parking lot. She looked scared, no, terrified, her eyes wide, hair all messy like she'd been through something bad. "Help me. Please, you have to help me," she cried, her voice shaky. She grabbed my arm, clutching it tight like I was the only person who could save her. I froze for a second, trying to make sense of what was happening. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" I asked, looking around, expecting someone else to show up, maybe a parent or another driver. "They're after me," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "I've been held for years. I escaped. Please, don't let them take me back." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing. Held captive? For years. This didn't seem real. It sounded like something straight out of a movie, but the way she looked filthy, her clothes torn, and her face pale, she didn't seem like she was making it up. I glanced toward the parking lot, but there was no one around. Just the empty rest stop and the two parked cars that looked like they'd been there for hours. The girl tugged at my sleeve again, her grip tightening. "They'll come looking for me. You have to hide me. Please." I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to rush her to my car, lock the doors, and drive away, but I was still trying to process what was happening. Before I could even respond, a man appeared from behind one of the parked cars. He was walking fast toward us, his face calm, too calm. He didn't look panicked or angry, just focused. "Excuse me, miss," he called out as he got closer. "That's my daughter." The girl's grip tightened on my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "He's lying," she hissed through clenched teeth, her voice barely a whisper now. "Please, don't let him take me." The man was maybe in his late 40s, dressed in a flammable shirt and jeans, like he'd just come off a camping trip or something. His face was clean-shaven, and he smiled as he approached, but there was something off about him. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I'm sorry if she's been bothering you," he said when he reached us, glancing down at the girl. "She's not well. She's been having some problems, mental health issues. We've been trying to get her help." The girl shook her head violently, stepping closer to me like I was her shield. "He's not my dad," she muttered, her voice trembling. "He's not. Please don't believe him." I felt like I was caught between two sides of a story, and I had no idea who to trust. The man's face was calm, too calm, like he'd rehearsed this whole thing a million times before. But the girl, her fear, it felt real. Too real to ignore. I cleared my throat, trying to sound as confident as I could. "Is there any way we can call someone? The police, maybe? Just to figure this out?" The man's smile faded, just for a second, but it was long enough for me to catch it. "That won't be necessary," he said, his voice steady. "She's just upset. We'll be on our way now." He reached for the girl's arm, but she jerked away, her eyes filling with tears. "Don't let him take me," she begged, her voice cracking. "I'll die if you let him take me." I backed up a step, putting myself between them, my heart racing now. "I think we should call the police," I said, my voice shaking despite trying to stay calm. "Just to be sure." The man's expression changed then, like a mask slipping. His eyes narrowed, and the calm demeanor vanished. "You don't need to get involved in this," he said, his voice harder now, almost threatening. "It's a family matter." I looked at the girl again, her face pleading with me to believe her. My gut twisted, and I could feel the tension building, like something bad was about to happen. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, trying to dial 911. Before I could hit the call button, the man took a step closer, his face inches from mine. "Put the phone down," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't what you think it is." I stood my ground, my thumb hovering over the screen. "I'm calling the police," I said, louder this time, hoping someone would hear me, hoping someone would show up. "If she's your daughter, they'll clear it up." The man's eyes flicked to the girl, then back to me. For a second, I thought he might try to grab the phone, but then he just smiled again. This cold, empty smile that sent chills down my spine. "Do what you need to do," he said, stepping back. "But I'll be here when they arrive." That threw me off. I didn't expect him to just back down. My thumb hovered over the phone screen, but before I could call, I heard the sound of tires crunching gravel. Another car pulling into the rest stop. A black van. The girl's face went pale when she saw it, her breath coming in short gasps. "Please," she whispered, backing away. "Please, don't let them take me." The van rolled to a stop, and the man stepped toward it, his whole demeanor shifting back to that calm, collected state. The side door of the van slid open, and two more men got out, both dressed casually but with the same unnerving calmness as the first guy. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea what was going on, but everything in me screamed that this wasn't right. These men, they weren't just trying to help a girl with mental health issues. I hit the call button on my phone and held it to my ear. The man glanced at me, but he didn't stop me. He just smiled at Colt, dead smile, as the two other men walked toward us. 911, what's your emergency? Came the operator's voice on the other end. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. The girl clutched my arm again, trembling, her eyes locked on the van. This is your last chance, the man said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't want to be involved in this. But I was involved now. I had no choice. I'm at a rest stop. I finally managed to say, my voice shaky. There's a girl here. She says she's been kidnapped. There's a van. Before I could finish, the man turned and walked toward the van. The two other men followed him, and without another word, they got back inside. The door slid shut, and the van pulled away, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, my heart pounding, the phone still pressed to my ear. The girl let out a shaky breath, her grip loosening on my arm. They're gone, I whispered, barely able to believe it myself. But the girl didn't relax. She just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. They'll come back, she said softly. They always come back. I stayed with her until the police arrived. I rented a cabin up north for a long weekend. It was one of those places you book online, nice pictures, looks included. The ad said it was perfect for anyone wanting to get away from it all. I needed that. Life had been stressful, worked too much, everything too much. A quiet place in the woods sounded like exactly what I needed. When I arrived, it was just as advertised. The cabin was tucked back from the road, surrounded by trees. There wasn't another house in sight. The closest neighbor was probably miles away. I unloaded my stuff, set up inside, and spent the first night just enjoying the quiet. No cars, no people, just the sound of the wind in the trees. I spent the next day hiking around, exploring the woods. There was a small lake nearby where I spent a couple of hours sitting by the water, not doing much of anything. I was feeling good, relaxed. But that afternoon, I noticed something I hadn't seen when I first arrived, a shed, not far from the cabin, tucked behind some trees. It was locked. The lock was heavy, rusted. I thought it was strange that the rental description hadn't mentioned it. It was the only thing on the property besides the cabin itself, and it looked old, like it had been there a long time. I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was something about that shed that bothered me. I told myself it was probably just for tools, maybe gardening supplies, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the second day, my curiosity got the best of me. I went out to the shed again and inspected the lock. It didn't look very secure, just old and rusted, like it hadn't been touched in years. I don't know what came over me, but I decided to break it open. I figured I'd come this far. It wasn't like anyone would notice. I found a crowbar in the cabin and went back out to the shed. It didn't take much effort. The lock broke with a snap, and the door creaked open. Inside, it was dark. The light from the afternoon barely reached in, so I took out my phone and used the flashlight to look around. It smelled damp, like mold. Dust hung in the air, and I could see old wooden shelves lining the walls, stacked with random items and tools, cans of paint, a few old crates. But then, in the corner, something caught my eye. There was a small table with something on it, something that looked out of place. I walked closer, the beam of my phone's light shaking in my hand. On the table were a few personal belongings, an old watch, a set of keys, a wallet. Next to them was a stack of Polaroid photos, faded and yellowed with age. I picked up the wallet first, opening it slowly. Inside, there was a driver's license. The name wasn't familiar, but the date of birth stood out. The license had expired over a decade ago. I looked at the keys next, house keys, maybe with a little keychain shaped like a dog. They didn't mean anything to me but the photos. I started flipping through them. They were all people, different people, some smiling, some looking away from the camera. The first few photos didn't seem strange. They looked like vacation shots, like people who had rented the cabin before. But as I kept going through them, the pictures became off. The people in the photos weren't smiling anymore. Some looked scared, like they didn't want their picture taken. The backgrounds were all the same, the cabin, the woods, the lake. In one of the last photos, I recognized the cabin's porch, the same place I had been sitting just that morning. The person in the picture was standing in the exact spot where I had been, staring straight at the camera, eyes wide with fear. I dropped the photos and stepped back, my heart pounding. What the hell was this? Why were these things locked in a shed on this property? Who are these people? I backed out of the shed, leaving the door open behind me. My mind was racing. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? I found some old photos in a shed? It didn't make sense. Maybe they were just left there by the previous owner, I told myself. Maybe it wasn't as weird as it seemed. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos, the fear in the faces of the people. I kept thinking about the last picture, the one on the porch. It felt like someone had been watching them, just like someone might be watching me. I got up several times during the night, pacing around the cabin, checking the windows. Everything was dark outside. The trees cast long shadows across the yard, and the only sound was the wind rustling the leaves. I kept telling myself that it was fine, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that someone had been here, and might still be here. The next morning, I decided to leave. I didn't care that I still had a day left on the rental. I packed my things quickly, avoiding the shed as I loaded the car. I wanted to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. Just as I was about to get in the car, I noticed something on the porch. I froze. It was a Polaroid photo, sitting on the wooden steps, face down. My hands were shaking as I bent down to pick it up. I already knew what it would be. When I turned it over, my stomach dropped. It was a picture of me, taken from behind, while I was standing at the edge of the lake. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anyone. But someone had been watching me. I threw the photo down, jumped in the car, and sped out of there. My heart didn't stop racing until I was miles away from the cabin, back on the highway, heading home. I couldn't stop thinking about it, who had taken that photo, and why had they left it for me to find. When I got home, I called the rental company, told them everything. They didn't seem to care. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard back from them. I didn't push it. I didn't want to know more. I tried to forget about it, to move on, but I couldn't. Every time I close my eyes, I see that last photo. I wonder who those people were, and what happened to them after their pictures were taken. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I get the feeling that someone is still watching me. My family lived in a small house with a white picket fence, but our neighbor's house was different. Bigger, newer, and always spotless, it looked out of place. The owner of that house, Mr. Collins, was a wealthy man who lived there with his wife, Mrs. Collins, and their 2-year-old daughter, Stacy. Mr. Collins was an odd man. He didn't speak much and kept to himself. But what stood out the most was his obsession with his car. He owned a sleek black sports car, the kind you only see in magazines. Every weekend, without fail, he would be outside, polishing and cleaning it as if it were made of gold. He would spend hours on that car, making sure every inch was perfect. Sometimes, I would watch him from my window, wondering why a car could mean so much to someone. Mrs. Collins was the complete opposite of her husband. She was always kind and friendly, often waving at me when she passed by. Sometimes, she would even stop to chat, asking about school or offering me some of the cookies she baked. Stacy was a happy little girl, always giggling and playing in their yard. The sight of them together was comforting, a rare bit of warmth in our otherwise quiet neighborhood. But then one day, everything changed. Mrs. Collins and Stacy disappeared. It was like they vanished into thin air. I remember the day the police came to our door, asking if we had seen Mrs. Collins or Stacy. They said Mr. Collins reported them missing, claiming his wife had left him and taken their daughter with her. My parents were shocked, but there wasn't much we could tell the police. We hadn't seen anything unusual, and like everyone else, we just assumed Mrs. Collins had left on her own. Weeks passed, then months, and there was no sign of them. The whole town buzzed with rumors, each one wilder than the last. Some said Mrs. Collins ran away with another man, while others whispered about something far darker. I tried to push it out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I saw Mr. Collins polishing his car, a chill ran down my spine. It felt wrong, like he was trying to distract himself from something horrible. One day, a few months after Mrs. Collins and Stacy had disappeared, something strange happened. My dad was in the garage, fixing up his old truck, when he noticed something odd in Mr. Collins' garage. The door was slightly open and inside, barely visible, was Mrs. Collins' white Jeep. It was covered in dust like it hadn't been touched in months. My dad called my mom and me over to see, and we all stood there, staring at it in shock. If Mrs. Collins had run away, why would her car still be here? A few days later, we noticed the Jeep was gone. Mr. Collins had sold it, or at least that's what we guessed. He didn't say anything to us, but the way he started acting was even stranger. He stopped going outside as much, and when he did, he seemed nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder like he was being watched. The once spotless car now had a layer of dirt on it, and his yard, which used to be immaculate, was beginning to look neglected. Then one night, something happened that I'll never forget. My parents and I were having dinner when we heard a loud crash from Mr. Collins' house. My dad grabbed a flashlight and told us to stay inside as he went to check it out. From the window, I watched him walk across the yard and knock on Mr. Collins' door. It took a long time for Mr. Collins to answer, and when he did, he looked pale, almost sick. My dad asked if everything was okay, but Mr. Collins just nodded and said he had dropped something. My dad came back inside, but he looked unsettled. He told us he had seen something strange when Mr. Collins opened the door. In the dim light of the hallway, he saw a pot of some kind of liquid on the stove and, next to it, a gun on the kitchen counter. He couldn't explain it, but something about the scene had disturbed him deeply. After that night, things seemed out of control. Mr. Collins became even more reclusive, and the whispers around town grew louder. Some people believed he had done something terrible to his wife and daughter, but there was no evidence, no proof, just suspicion and fear. I started having nightmares about it, about what could have happened behind those closed doors. The thought that something terrible might have taken place so close to home was terrifying. Years have passed since then, and I've grown up, moved away, and tried to leave those memories behind. But now and then I think about Mrs. Collins and Stacy. I wonder what happened to them, where they are now, and if they ever found safety. I'll never forget the sight of that white Jeep in the garage, the look on Mr. Collins' face when my dad knocked on his door, or the fear that gripped our town in the months that followed. Sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I still feel that chill running down my spine. I'll never know for sure, but I fear the worst. And I hope, wherever they are, that Mrs. Collins and Stacy are safe, far away from the man who spent so much time polishing his car. I had been delivering food for a few months now, driving around the city and getting to know every corner of it. Most nights were routine: pick up the order, follow the GPS, drop it off, and move on to the next one. But this night was different. It was late, maybe past midnight, and I had just received an order from a part of town I didn't recognize. The GPS led me away from the familiar roads and into a neighborhood I had never seen before. The houses were spaced far apart, and the streets seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. Each corner I turned seemed to take me deeper into the maze of narrow roads and dark alleys. The streetlights were few and far between, casting long, eerie shadows that made the entire area feel off. The further I drove, the more I felt like something was wrong. The roads didn't seem to match up with the map on my phone. I would make a turn, and suddenly the GPS would tell me to turn back, as if the streets were changing while I drove. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach. But I knew I had to deliver the order. That was the job. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the GPS announced that I had arrived. I slowed the car and looked at the house. It stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, a tall, narrow building with peeling paint and broken windows. The lawn was overgrown, the grass reaching up to my knees, and there was no sign of life. It looked abandoned. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the gear shift, ready to put the car in reverse and get out of there. But then I thought about the order, about the customer waiting for their food. Maybe it was just an old house, and someone still lived there. Maybe they were just too busy or too tired to fix it up. I tried to shake off the unease that clung to me like a cold fog. I got out of the car, taking the bag of food with me. The air was thick and heavy, almost suffocating. As I walked toward the house, the gravel crunched under my feet, the only sound in the silent night. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. My skin prickled with the sensation of a chill running down my spine. When I reached the porch, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. It creaked open with the slightest push, revealing a dark hallway that stretched into the unknown. I could barely see a few feet inside, the darkness swallowing everything beyond that. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, just the echo of my voice bouncing back at me from the empty hall. Something deep inside me screamed to leave, to drop the food and run back to the car. But I took another step forward, peering into the darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like leaves being dragged across the ground. I turned to look back at the street, and that's when I saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, stepping out from between the houses and around the corners. They moved silently, almost like they were gliding across the ground. My heart started pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as they got closer. The first one stepped into the dim light of the porch, and I could see it. It was a person, but their face was hidden behind a blank, white mask. The mask had no features, just smooth, cold porcelain. The others followed, all wearing the same eerie, expressionless masks. They surrounded me, their presence pressing in on me from all sides. I tried to back away, but I was trapped against the porch railing. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, my mind racing for a way out. One of them reached out, and I flinched, dropping the bag of food to the ground. Their hands were cold as ice as they grabbed me, pulling me toward the house. I struggled, trying to break free, but they were too strong. The more I fought, the tighter their grip became. They didn't say a word, didn't make a sound as they dragged me inside. The door slammed shut behind us, plunging me into darkness. I was blind, my other senses taking over. I could hear their footsteps around me, soft but purposeful. I could feel their cold hands on me, searching through my pockets, taking my wallet, my phone, and my keys. I wanted to scream to call for help, but the sound died in my throat. It was as if the darkness had swallowed my voice. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. All I could feel was the overwhelming dread, the terror that gripped me as they continued to strip me of everything I had. Finally, they let go of me, and I collapsed to the floor, trembling. I could hear their footsteps fading away, the creak of the door opening and closing again. They were gone, leaving me alone in the pitch-black house. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too scared to move. My mind replayed the events over and over, trying to understand, but there was no understanding. It was like I had stepped into another world, a place where the rules didn't apply, where nothing made sense. Eventually, I forced myself to stand up, my legs shaking beneath me. I found the door, pushed it open, and stumbled out into the night. The street was empty, no sign of the masked figures, no sign of anyone. My car was still there, untouched as if nothing had happened. I had been robbed, not just of my belongings, but of something more, my sense of safety, my trust in the world around me. I drove away from that house as fast as I could, the streets still twisting and turning, leading me in circles until I finally found my way out. When I reached the main road, I didn't look back. I just kept driving, trying to escape the memory of those blank masks, of the cold hands that had pulled me into the darkness. But I knew, no matter how far I drove, I would never truly escape. The fear would always be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting to drag me back into that twisting, endless nightmare. The fluorescent lights and the distant beeps from machines made the place feel eerie when the sun went down. The only real escape was the basement office, a small, dimly lit room where I spent most of my nights when things were slow. The office was right next to the morgue, a place I tried not to think about too much. It was around midnight, maybe a little after, and I was sitting in the office with another orderly. We weren't doing much, just passing the time with idle conversation and the occasional glance at the clock, waiting for our shifts to end. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant, the kind that clings to your clothes and fills your lungs. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the overhead light and the distant rumble of the air conditioning. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, not like the rushed steps of a doctor or nurse. The sound caught both of our attention, and we turned to look at the open doorway. A man was passing by, his eyes flicking toward us as he walked. There was something off about the way he looked at us, something shifty and unsettling. He didn't say anything, just kept walking, but I felt a strange chill creep up my spine. A few moments later, the man came back. This time, he stopped at the doorway and looked at us. He had a pale, almost sickly complexion, and his eyes were wide as if he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were neat but outdated, like something out of an old movie. He didn't seem like he belonged there, like he was out of place in the sterile modern hospital. "Do you have access to the morgue?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. I exchanged a glance with the other orderly. We both assumed he was doing a pickup for a funeral home. It wasn't entirely unusual, though the time of night made it strange. "Yes," I said cautiously, wondering what he was doing here so late. The man's expression didn't change, but there was a glint in his eyes that made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about him just wasn't right. I expected him to mention a name or give some sort of explanation, but he didn't. Instead, he just stood there, staring at us with that unsettling look. Then he said something that made my heart skip a beat. "I'll pay you to let me in. Just for an hour. I need to be alone with the bodies." The words hung in the air like a bad smell, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The other orderly and I exchanged another look, this one filled with disbelief and unease. The man didn't seem to notice our discomfort. His gaze was fixed, almost desperate, like he was waiting for us to say yes. I could feel the tension in the room, thick and suffocating. My mind raced as I tried to process what he was asking. Who would want to be alone in the morgue at this time of night? And why? The whole situation felt wrong, like a scene from a nightmare. "We can't do that," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. "It's against hospital policy." The man's expression darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue or try to persuade us. But then he seemed to realize that we weren't going to budge. His eyes narrowed, and he clenched his jaw, the muscles in his face twitching slightly. He didn't say anything, just stared at us with a look that made my skin crawl. Finally, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The other orderly and I sat there in stunned silence, the gravity of what had just happened slowly sinking in. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly avoided something terrible. "We should tell security," I said after a few moments. The other orderly nodded, and we quickly made our way upstairs to the security office. The hospital felt even more ominous as we walked through the empty halls, the shadows seeming to stretch and grow in the dim light. When we reached the security office, we found the guard on duty and explained what had happened. As soon as we described the man, the guard's expression changed. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with recognition. "Did he say anything about wanting to be alone in the morgue?" The guard asked, his voice tense. "Yes," I replied, the unease in my stomach deepening. The guard let out a heavy sigh and shook his head. "He's tried this before? We've had a few run-ins with him over the past couple of months. He always disappears before we can catch him, but we know he's up to something." The man had done this before? What could he possibly want with the bodies in the morgue? My mind conjured up all sorts of disturbing possibilities, none of them comforting. The guard assured us that they would increase their patrols and keep an eye out for the man, but the whole experience left me shaken. As I made my way back to the basement office, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had come dangerously close to something dark and twisted. The hospital didn't feel safe anymore, not like it ever really had, but now it was different. Now, it felt like a place where the shadows hid secrets too terrible to imagine. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. His pale face, his desperate eyes, the way he had asked to be left alone with the dead. It all played over and over in my mind like a broken record. Even after my shift ended and I went home, the unease lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. I never saw the man again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Every time I walked past the morgue, I felt that same chill, the one that reminded me of how close we had come to letting something monstrous slip through our fingers. In 2019, when I was 13 years old, my dad took me hunting in the Pine Barrens. We had been there before, but this time it felt different. It was darker, and the trees seemed closer together like they were trying to trap us. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of damp leaves and pine needles. It was so quiet that even the wind barely made a sound. We arrived just before sunset, setting up near the edge of the forest. My dad always told me the best time to hunt was at night, when the animals were more active. I wasn't scared. I had been hunting with my dad before, and I trusted him. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness swallowed the trees, I began to feel uneasy. The shadows stretched longer, turning the forest into a maze of dark shapes. We walked deeper into the woods, our boots crunching softly on the leaves. My dad had his rifle, and I carried a smaller one he had given me for my birthday. I held it close to my chest, feeling the cool metal against my palms. The deeper we went, the thicker the trees grew, blocking out the moonlight. Soon, the only light came from our flashlights. Now and then we would stop, listening for any sign of movement. My dad was good at tracking animals, and he would often crouch down to inspect the ground. But that night, we didn't hear or see anything. No rustling leaves, no snapping twigs. It was like the forest had gone completely still. After an hour of walking, I started to feel tired. My legs ached, and I wanted to rest. My dad noticed and suggested we sit down for a bit. We found a small clearing and sat on a fallen log. The forest was so quiet that I could hear my heartbeat. My dad whispered something about waiting for the right moment, but I barely heard him. I was too focused on the darkness around us. Suddenly, there was a sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the snapping of a twig. It was a low growl, deep and guttural, like something big was watching us. My heart sped up, and I looked at my dad. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale. He slowly reached for his rifle, motioning for me to do the same. The growl came again, this time closer. It echoed through the trees, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I gripped my rifle tighter, my hands shaking. My dad stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the trees. He didn't say a word, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something we had ever encountered before. Then, from the shadows, a figure appeared. It was tall, much taller than any animal I had seen before. Its body was hunched over, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. It had the shape of a wolf, but much larger, almost like it didn't belong in this world. The growling grew louder, more aggressive. The creature's breath was visible in the cold night air, and I could see its sharp teeth glinting in the faint light of our flashlights. My dad whispered for me to stay still, but my legs felt like they were going to give out. I didn't move, frozen in place, as the creature slowly stepped closer. Its growl turned into a snarl, its yellow eyes locked on us. My dad raised his rifle, aiming it at the creature, but he didn't shoot. It was like we both knew that shooting wouldn't help us. The creature circled us, moving through the shadows. Every time I thought it was gone, it would appear again, its glowing eyes watching us from the dark. I could barely breathe, my chest tight with fear. We were trapped, surrounded by darkness, and this terrifying creature. The creature let out a loud, bone-chilling howl, so loud that it seemed to shake the trees around us. My dad grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. Without thinking, I ran. I could hear my dad running behind me, and the creature's growls echoed through the forest. The trees blurred as we sprinted through the underbrush, branches scratching at my arms and face. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to collapse. But I didn't stop. We ran deeper into the forest, not caring which direction we were going. All I knew was that I had to get away from that creature. But the more we ran, the more lost we became. The familiar trails had disappeared, and every direction looked the same, just endless dark trees and shadows. After what felt like hours, we stopped to catch our breath. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs shook from exhaustion. My dad leaned against a tree, his face pale and sweaty. The growling had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. "We need to keep moving," my dad said, his voice barely a whisper. But I didn't know where to go. We were lost in the pine barrens, and that creature was still out there, watching us. We wandered through the forest for what seemed like hours, trying to find our way back to the truck. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow looked like the creature. My flashlight was starting to die, its beam growing weaker. The thought of being stuck in the forest in complete darkness terrified me. Just when I thought we would never find our way out, we stumbled upon a familiar path. It was narrow and overgrown, but I recognized it from earlier. My dad let out a sigh of relief, and we followed the path back to the truck. When we finally reached it, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I climbed into the passenger seat, my hands still shaking. My dad started the engine, and we drove away. The dark trees of the pine barrens fading into the distance. We didn't speak on the ride home. The encounter with that creature was something neither of us could explain, and I didn't want to think about it anymore. But as I looked out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the forest that night. We made it out unharmed, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go hunting in the pine barrens again. I've been working the night shift at this gas station for about a year now. The place sits on the edge of town, far enough away that we don't get too much traffic during the late hours. It's a quiet job most of the time. I just sit behind the counter, ring up the occasional customer, and watch the clock slowly crawl towards morning. The night this all happened was no different from the others. It was around 2:30 a.m., and I was getting ready for the end of my shift. The store was empty, as it usually is at this time. The lights outside cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning inside the store. I had been counting the cash from the register, making sure everything was in order. My manager always told me to be careful, especially at night. "You never know who might come through that door," she'd say. I didn't think much of it then. I thought I had everything under control. I had just finished counting the last of the bills when the front door suddenly slammed open. The sound was so loud I nearly jumped out of my seat. Before I could even register what was happening, a man stormed inside. He looked rough, dirty clothes, wild eyes, and he smelled like he hadn't showered in days. He didn't say anything. His eyes were locked on the cash I was holding in my hand. My body froze for a second, and everything seemed to slow down. I knew I should have done something, but I just stood there. Without warning, he lunged at me, grabbing the cash from my hands. It all happened so fast. One second I had the money in my hands, the next it was gone, and the man was already halfway to the door. That's when my instincts finally kicked in. I don't know what came over me, but I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I bolted from behind the counter and ran after him, shouting for him to stop. The adrenaline pumping through my veins drowned out any fear I might have felt. The guy wasn't moving too fast. He stumbled as he reached the parking lot, his movements unsteady. I figured he had to be on something. Drugs, maybe. I could see the money sticking out of his jacket pocket as he tried to make his escape. "Stop right there," he turned around, panic in his eyes. He tried to run faster, but his body wasn't cooperating. I closed the gap between us, and without thinking, I grabbed him by the arm. He struggled, trying to shake me off, but I held on. We wrestled for a moment before he broke free and started running again, but he wasn't getting far. My heart was racing, but I wasn't about to give up. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I explained the situation to the operator. I told them where I was, describing the man and what had just happened. They told me officers were on their way. I kept following him, keeping a safe distance now. I didn't want to corner him. Who knows what a desperate man might do? He didn't seem to notice that I was still trailing him. He was more focused on running, though it was clear he wasn't going to get far. His pace was slowing, and he kept looking over his shoulder. After what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes, I heard the distant sound of police sirens. The man heard it too. He stopped dead in his tracks, his whole body tensing up. I stayed back, not wanting to spook him any further. Within moments, the police cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. 2 officers got out, guns drawn, ordering the man to get on the ground. He hesitated for a moment, but he knew it was over. Slowly, he dropped to his knees and put his hands behind his head. The officers moved in, cuffing him and pulling him to his feet. One of them came over to me, asking me for details. I explained everything, still trying to catch my breath. My hands were trembling, but I tried to stay calm as I recounted what happened. They searched the man and found the cash still stuffed in his jacket. One of the officers told me that the man was homeless and likely on drugs, which explained his erratic behavior. He had probably been desperate, looking for anything he could get his hands on. I watched as they led him to the back of the squad car, his head hanging low. A part of me felt sorry for him, living on the streets, addicted to something that was ruining his life. But at the same time, I was relieved that the whole ordeal was over. The officers thanked me for my quick response, telling me I did the right thing by calling them. They said that chasing him wasn't the safest option, but they understood why I did it. I nodded, still shaken by the whole thing. After the police left, I went back inside the gas station. The place felt different now. What was once just another quiet night on the job had turned into something I wouldn't forget anytime soon. I sat behind the counter, trying to calm my nerves, my hands still feeling shaky. I looked at the clock. My shift was almost over, but I wasn't counting the minutes like I usually did. I just sat there, staring at the front door, half expecting someone else to burst through. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I came to something worse. When my shift finally ended, I grabbed my things and left, locking the doors behind me. As I walked to my car, I couldn't help but think about the man. Life had beaten him down, and in his desperation, he made a choice that landed him in the back of a police car. But as I drove home, I realized something. I was lucky. Things could have gone a lot worse that night. The road stretched out before us, dark and winding, as we drove through the forest. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun, just me, Devin, and our friends, Bethany and Seth, heading out for a camping trip. The college semester had been brutal, and we all needed a break. The thought of sleeping under the stars, roasting marshmallows, and telling ghost stories by the fire made us all excited. But something about that night felt different. The trees seemed to loom closer to the road, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy above, casting strange shadows that danced across the pavement. I tried to shake off the unease that settled in the pit of my stomach, convincing myself it was just the excitement of the trip. We were laughing, the radio playing our favorite songs, when suddenly a sharp turn came out of nowhere. Devin, who was driving, tried to swerve, but the car skidded on the wet road. The world spun around us as the tires screeched and the car went off the road, crashing into the trees. I heard Bethany scream, and then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, we were all standing outside the car. It was crumpled against a tree, the front smashed in, steam rising from the engine. I felt strange, like everything was muffled, distant. Bethany stood next to me, her face pale, and Seth was on the other side, staring at the wreckage. "Is everyone okay?" I asked, my voice sounding oddly flat. Bethany nodded slowly, but she didn't look at me. Seth was silent, his eyes fixed on the car. I turned to see what he was staring at, and that's when my heart dropped. Inside the car, still strapped into our seats, were our bodies. I blinked, unable to process what I was seeing. There I was, slumped over in the passenger seat, a trickle of blood running down my forehead. Devin was still gripping the steering wheel, his face twisted in pain. Bethany and Seth were in the back, their faces ashen. "We're outside the car," Bethany whispered, finally looking at me. Her eyes were wide with fear, but we're still in there. I didn't know what to think. It felt like a nightmare, but everything was so vivid, so real. I reached out to touch the car, but my hand passed right through the metal. Panic started to build in my chest. "Are we dead?" Seth finally spoke, his voice trembling. I didn't want to answer. The thought was too horrifying, too impossible. But what else could explain what was happening? We were standing here, outside our bodies, unable to touch anything, unable to feel anything. The forest around us seemed to grow darker, the trees closing in, the air thick with something I couldn't describe. It felt like we were being watched, like something was waiting for us in the shadows. I tried to move, to walk away from the car, but my feet felt heavy as if something was pulling me back. "We have to get out of here," I said, trying to sound brave, but my voice cracked. Maybe there's a way to fix this. But where could we go? We were in the middle of the woods, far from any town or help. The only thing that seemed real was the car and the broken bodies inside. Time passed in a blur. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at ourselves, trapped in that sinking vehicle. The night seemed endless, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Every sound in the forest, every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch, made my heart race. It felt like the trees themselves were whispering, mocking us, telling us that we didn't belong in this world anymore. At some point, I started to feel dizzy, like I was being pulled into a deep, dark hole. My vision blurred, and the sounds around me faded. I could hear Bethany crying and could see Seth's terrified face, but it all seemed far away. Then everything went black again. When I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital bed. The bright lights above me stung my eyes, and the beeping of machines filled the room. I turned my head slowly, feeling groggy, like I was waking up from a long, terrible dream. Devin was in the bed next to me, his eyes half open, and I could see Bethany and Seth in the room as well, all of us hooked up to monitors, bandages covering our wounds. "We were alive," I whispered, not quite believing it. A nurse came into the room, checking our vitals, smiling warmly. "You all had a nasty accident, but you're going to be okay," she said. "You've been unconscious for a couple of days, but you're out of danger now." I could hardly process her words. My mind was still reeling from what we had experienced. I looked at Bethany, who was staring back at me with wide eyes. Seth was silent, his face pale, but there was relief in his expression. It had felt so real, the crash, our bodies trapped in that sinking car, the fear that we were ghosts. But now, lying in this hospital bed, I wasn't sure what to believe. Had it all been a dream, some kind of shared nightmare brought on by the trauma of the crash? As the nurse continued to check on us, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It didn't feel like a nightmare, not entirely. The memory of that dark forest, the sinking feeling of being trapped outside my own body, lingered in my mind, too vivid to ignore. But as I looked at my friends, safe and alive, I tried to push the thoughts away. We were okay, we had survived. The nightmare was over. After a long, exhausting shift as a pizza delivery driver during a heat wave, all I wanted was to finish my last delivery and head home. My shirt was sticking to my back, my hair was damp with sweat, and my legs felt like they could give out at any moment. The sun had long set, but the heat still lingered, thick and oppressive, like a blanket you couldn't kick off. My throat was dry and my mouth tasted like cardboard from too many hours without water. But the worst part, I desperately needed to use the bathroom. I checked the address one more time as I pulled up to the house. The place was dark, with no lights on, inside or outside. The house looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, windows dirty, paint peeling, and the front lawn overgrown. I parked my car and grabbed the pizza box, hoping this would be quick. But something about the house made me uneasy. It felt abandoned, like a place forgotten by time, the kind of place where shadows seem to move on their own. I walked up to the front door, and the silence was deafening. No crickets, no distant traffic, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered. I rang again, waiting, feeling the sweat drip down my neck. Still nothing. I pulled out my phone and called the number on the order. After a few rings, a woman's voice answered, out of breath and apologetic. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm on my way." Please just wait a few minutes. Her voice was shaky, like she was trying to hide something, or someone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Okay, I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. I'll wait. But the need to relieve myself was growing unbearable. I glanced around, hoping to find some sign of life, a neighbor, maybe even a stray cat, anything that would make this place feel less creepy. But the street was empty. It was just me and this old, eerie house. I couldn't wait any longer. There was a large bush near the front of the house, thick with leaves. It was dark enough to give me some privacy, so I walked over, glancing around one last time before unzipping my pants. Relief washed over me as I let go, the tension in my body finally easing. But then something moved. A rustle in the bushes, right in front of me. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled back, almost falling over as I zipped up my pants. In the dim light, I saw a figure. Someone crouched low in the bush, their face hidden in shadows. I had just peed on a man. The man suddenly bolted out of the bush, sprinting away before I could even process what had just happened. He didn't look back, just ran like his life depended on it, disappearing into the darkness of the night. I stood there frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who was he? What was he doing hiding in that bush? And why did he run? I looked down and saw something glinting in the faint light. A bag half hidden in the leaves. I reached down, hands shaking, and pulled it out. It was a small, worn backpack. And when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a roll of duct tape, a knife with a serrated edge, and a length of rope. My breath caught in my throat. This was no ordinary bag. This was something a person would carry if they had bad intentions. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This man, the one hiding in the bushes, wasn't just some vagrant or a thief. He was planning something terrible, and I had interrupted him. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what had happened. I told them about the man, the bag, the woman, who was supposed to be coming to the house. They assured me help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity before I heard the distant wail of sirens. I paced the front yard, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, expecting the man to return at any moment. Then I saw her, a woman walking quickly down the street, looking over her shoulder every few seconds. She was the one who had called. The customer. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and when she saw me, she broke into a run. "You have to help me," she said, her voice trembling as she reached me. "He's after me. My ex, he's dangerous." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed her arm and pulled her towards my car. "Get in," I said, trying to sound calm even though my heart was racing. "We'll wait for the police here." She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she climbed into the passenger seat. I locked the doors, my eyes scanning the dark street, waiting for any sign of movement. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the flashing lights of police cars filled the street. Officers poured out, and I waved them over, explaining everything as quickly as I could. They moved swiftly, searching the area, but the man was long gone. The only thing left behind was the bag I had found. The woman was safe, and they took her statement, reassuring her that they would do everything they could to find her ex. I watched as she was led to one of the police cars, her face a mix of relief and lingering fear. As for me, I drove home that night, and the image of that man in the bushes burned into my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't been there, and if I hadn't needed to relieve myself at that exact moment. It wasn't just luck. Deep down, I knew I had been meant to be there, and the thought of how close that woman came to something terrible left me deeply shaken. I'll never forget that night, the way the shadows seemed to move, the oppressive heat pressing down on me, and the feeling of cold fear creeping up my spine. A few years ago, my best friend Kevin and I made a plan to explore an old, abandoned house on the edge of our town. We had heard many stories about it being haunted, but we didn't believe them. We thought it would be fun, something thrilling to do on a boring weekend. Little did we know, that decision would change how we saw things forever. The house was on a hill, far from any other buildings. It looked ancient, with cracked walls and broken windows. The roof had caved in at some spots, and vines covered most of the house, making it look like it was being swallowed by nature. As we approached, I felt an uneasy feeling in my chest. Kevin, always the brave one, walked ahead confidently. "We'll just go in, take a look around, and leave," Kevin said, trying to sound calm. I nodded, though a strange sense of dread was creeping up on me. The air around the house felt heavier and colder, like something was wrong. I shook off the feeling, and followed Kevin through the broken gate. The front door was hanging off its hinges, creaking as we pushed it open. Inside, the house was dark and smelled of dust and decay. The floor was covered in dirt, and old furniture lay scattered, broken and forgotten. The silence inside was suffocating, broken only by the faint sounds of the wind blowing through the cracks in the walls. Kevin started walking around, looking at the old furniture and the peeling wallpaper. I stayed close behind him, my eyes scanning every corner of the room. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As we moved deeper into the house, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Kevin, on the other hand, was still acting like nothing was wrong. We reached a narrow staircase that led up to the second floor. Kevin turned to me with a grin. "Let's check upstairs," he said. I hesitated. "Maybe we should just look around down here," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. But Kevin was already climbing the stairs, the old wood creaking under his weight. I sighed and followed him, gripping the railing tightly. The second floor was even darker than the first. The windows were either boarded up or too dirty to let in any light. As we walked down the hallway, I noticed something strange. The air up here was colder, and there was a foul smell, like something rotten. I wanted to tell Kevin that we should leave, but before I could say anything, we heard it. A low, deep growl echoed through the hallway. Kevin froze, and I felt my blood turn to ice. The sound was coming from behind a door at the end of the hall. It wasn't an animal growl. It was something much more sinister. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice shaking. But Kevin, stubborn as ever, started walking toward the door. "It's probably just the wind or something," he said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. As he reached for the door, the growling grew louder, more menacing. My heart was racing, and every instinct in me screamed to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Kevin slowly pushed the door open, and what we saw inside made my stomach churn. The room was dark, but in the corner we could see a shadow, a figure that wasn't quite human. It was hunched over, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. The growling stopped, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then the figure spoke in a voice that made my skin crawl. "Leave, or never leave again." The words hung in the air like a curse. Kevin and I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Without a second thought, we turned and bolted down the hallway. The house seemed to come alive around us, the walls groaning and the floor creaking as if something was chasing us. We stumbled down the stairs, barely keeping our balance, and sprinted for the front door. The air around us felt thick, like it was trying to pull us back. But we didn't stop. We ran out of the house, through the broken gate, and didn't look back until we were far enough away to catch our breath. When we finally stopped, both of us were gasping for air, our hearts pounding in our chests. We stood there in the empty field, staring at the house in the distance. It looked the same as before, quiet and still, but we knew better now. We never talked about that day again, but the memory of it stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had escaped something dangerous, something that didn't want us there. The words of the figure echoed in my mind, "Leave or never leave again." To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that house, but one thing was certain: we had come too close to something beyond our understanding. Something dark and twisted lived in that house, and it had made sure we knew it. From that day on, I avoided that hill, that house. Whatever was in there, I didn't want to find out. We were lucky to escape, but not everyone might be as fortunate. And I never forgot the warning, "Leave or never leave again."